Beneath the forests of the Carpathians and the shadows of Rome's legions lies a story of a people who believed death was not an end, but a doorway. Their glory burned brief and bright, and though their kingdom fell in fire, their echo still shapes the memory of nations today. Long before the world would come to know the name of Dacia, the lands of the lower Danube and the high Carpathian ridges were the home of a people the ancients called Thracians. Scattered across the Balkans, from the shores of the Aegean to the plains of the Black Sea, these tribes spoke a common tongue, shared familiar customs, and yet lived in hundreds of small, often quarreling communities. To the Greeks, who first wrote of them, the Thracians were both alluring and fearsome, described as lovers of music and wine, but also as wild warriors whose ferocity on the battlefield could not be contained. It was from this vast cultural forest that the Dacians would one day emerge, a single tree among many, reaching for its own identity while still rooted in Thracian soil. The Thracian world was not a single nation, but a constellation of tribes. Names like the Odrysians, the Bessi, the Triballi, and the Getae appear in ancient accounts, each with its own chiefs and sacred places. They were horsemen and herdsmen, farmers of fertile valleys, hunters in the deep forests, and raiders who crossed rivers to trouble their neighbours. Their warriors fought with spears and falx, a curved blade that would one day become the iconic weapon of the Dacians. Their wealth lay in herds, in amber and honey, in the iron pulled from the Carpathian veins, and in the trade goods carried along river routes from the distant Black Sea colonies. Myth and ritual shaped the Thracian heart. They believed in gods of the sky and the earth, in deities of war and of harvest. Dionysus, the god of wine, was said by the Greeks to have come from Thracian soil, and indeed the vine was sacred to them, both gift and curse, a source of joy and frenzy. The Thracians honoured their warriors with burial mounds rising like small hills across the landscape, graves filled with ornaments of gold and weapons meant for use in another life. Music and song wove through their ceremonies. Flutes, drums, and lyres echoed in valleys, not merely as entertainment, but as ways of crossing the threshold between the living and the unseen. It was among the Getae, a Thracian branch living along the Danube's northern banks, that a unique vision of immortality began to take hold. Greek historians wrote of a figure named Zalmoxis, a prophet, teacher, or perhaps even a god. He preached that death was not an end, but a transformation, that the soul continued beyond the grave into another realm of existence. To prove his teaching, the story goes, Zalmoxis disappeared into an underground chamber for 3 years, leading his followers to believe he had died, only to reappear alive and radiant, convincing them of eternal life. This belief in immortality would become a central pillar of the Dacian spirit, giving their warriors the fierce courage that terrified Rome centuries later. The Thracians stood at crossroads. To the south were the Greeks, whose bustling colonies dotted the Black Sea coast. These Greeks brought pottery, coinage, olive oil, and new ideas of art and governance. The Thracians traded eagerly, selling grain, honey, timber, and slaves in return. But contact also brought conflict. Raiders from the hills clashed with Greek merchants, and mercenaries from Thracian tribes were hired to fight in distant Greek wars. The Thracians were admired for their skill with cavalry, their deadly archers, and their ferocity with the double-handed axe. To the west and north, steppe nomads pressed in, Scythians with their swift horses, and later the Sarmatians. Their raids brought fire and destruction, but also new weapons and tactics that the Thracians learned to copy. Though divided into countless tribes, the Thracians were linked by shared traditions and a common landscape. Their villages perched on high ground, protected by wooden palisades. Fields of barley and wheat stretched along riverbanks, tended by families who also raised cattle and sheep. Women played a vital role in household economy, weaving textiles and producing pottery that carried distinctive Thracian designs. Warriors marked their rank with tattoos and ornaments, their bodies becoming living canvases of identity and pride. The Thracians' reputation spread far beyond their homelands. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before Christ, claimed they were the second most numerous people in the world, surpassed only by the Indians, but weakened by their refusal to unite under one king. This inability to forge unity would haunt their descendants, for only when a rare leader emerged could the fractious tribes stand together against great empires. Yet, out of this fractured world, the seeds of something distinct were already growing. Among the Thracians of the north, between the Carpathian Mountains and the Danube, cultural traits were coalescing into a new identity, one that would soon be known as Dacian. The Dacians inherited Thracian religion, but gave it sharper definition. They built sanctuaries of stone and timber in their highland fortresses, places where priests observed the heavens and offered sacrifices. They retained Zalmoxis's promise of immortality, a belief that infused their armies with almost reckless bravery. They adopted Thracian weapons but perfected the falx into a terrifying tool capable of slicing through Roman armor. They sang the same songs and played the same flutes, but in the echo of their mountains, these traditions took on a unique resonance. In Thracian myth, the warrior and the shaman often walked side by side. The Dacians carried this duality forward, fusing martial power with mystical conviction. Their kings ruled not only by strength of arms, but also by claiming divine sanction. Their people were farmers and herdsmen, but also builders of citadels and sanctuaries that spoke to both worldly need and spiritual yearning. They were heirs to centuries of Thracian tradition, yet already turning into something new, forged by geography, conflict, and belief. By the time Rome's legions began to press along the Danube frontier, the Thracian world had already fractured. To the south, many tribes had been subdued or absorbed by Macedonia and later by Rome. To the west, Celtic migrations brought new influences. But in the north, in the mountain strongholds, the Dacians endured. They carried the old Thracian spirit, but clothed it in new armor, sharpened it into new weapons, and bound it with a faith in immortality that would one day make them both feared and admired. The story of the Dacians cannot be told without first walking through the shadows of the Thracians, for it was in that vast, diverse, and often chaotic world that the roots of their culture took hold. The Thracians gave them gods and myths, music and warcraft, courage and contradiction. Out of this inheritance the Dacians would rise, a people at once ancient and new, destined to carve their brief, brilliant, and tragic place in history. Under the shadow of the Carpathians, the Thracian tribes who would one day become the Dacians lived in scattered communities, bound less by kings than by blood and custom. These tribes spoke a common language and shared beliefs in gods who ruled sky, earth, and underworld, yet they lived in rival clusters, each guarding its valleys, pastures, and fields. For centuries, life in the Carpathian cradle was a rhythm of planting and harvest, hunting and herding, raiding and defending, all set against the immovable presence of mountains and the eternal flow of the Danube. At first, power lay in kinship groups. Families banded together, defending hilltop villages with wooden palisades. Chiefs were chosen for their prowess in battle, their ability to lead hunts, and their skill in maintaining the fragile balance between neighbors. But as populations grew, competition for resources increased. Fertile valleys became prizes, and the richest pasture lands drew raids. Conflict slowly pushed communities towards stronger alliances. Bands of warriors rallied around charismatic leaders, men who could unite multiple tribes, not through decree, but through persuasion, reputation, and the promise of shared plunder. These were societies in transition, shifting between the ancient patterns of scattered tribal life and the emerging structures of early kingdoms. Archaeology shows us fortified settlements rising on heights, with walls of stone and earth that could resist prolonged attack. Within, clusters of homes surrounded central courtyards, where families gathered and craftsmen worked. Pottery was simple but functional, made for storage and daily use. Weapons were never far from hand, for war was as constant as the seasons. Spears, swords, and curved blades known as falx became symbols of status as much as tools of survival. Religion also played its part in this evolution. Priests, or perhaps shamans, gained influence as keepers of sacred knowledge and interpreters of divine will. Ritual centers were built in stone, circular sanctuaries aligned with the stars, places where offerings were made to Zalmoxis and other gods. Belief in immortality encouraged warriors to risk their lives freely, binding tribes together through the conviction that death was not an end but a transformation. Such faith provided not just courage but unity, a spiritual glue that leaders could harness to strengthen their authority. By the time Greek colonies flourished on the Black Sea coast, the northern Thracian tribes had grown more organized. Trade enriched certain chieftains who controlled access to salt, amber, and metal resources. Through exchange with Greeks and Celts, they gained not only wealth but new techniques, coinage, improved weapon designs, and ideas of kingship. The Celts in particular brought influence, their migrations pressing into the Carpathians and introducing artistic styles and ironworking practices that the tribes quickly adopted. Contact with outsiders accelerated the transition from tribes to proto-kingdoms, yet unity remained fragile. Herodotus observed that the Thracians could have ruled the world if only they had chosen one leader. Instead, they remained fractured, often fighting one another as fiercely as they fought external enemies. Still, moments of unification did occur under great leaders, men who managed to bend tribal pride into a larger cause. Among these, Burebista in the 1st century before Christ stands as the greatest example, forging a Dacian kingdom that stretched across much of the region. But before his rise, the centuries of conflict, cooperation, and adaptation within the Carpathian cradle had laid the groundwork for such a transformation. The Dacians were never born fully formed. They were shaped gradually, from the chaos of small tribes learning to survive in a rugged land. Step by step, through battles fought and alliances forged, through sanctuaries raised on mountaintops and fortresses built on stone ridges, they moved towards something larger than kinship. Out of bloodlines and valleys, out of faith and steel, kingdoms began to take shape. The tribes were still many, but the idea of unity was no longer a dream. It was becoming a reality, carried forward by leaders who saw beyond village walls, toward the possibility of a nation. In the lands north of the Danube, where the Carpathian mountains curve like a protective arm, small clusters of tribes slowly began to weave themselves into something greater. These were the Getae and the Dacians, names often blurred together in ancient accounts, for they shared the same tongue, the same faith, and the same customs. They lived in villages scattered across valleys and ridges, bound by kinship and loyalty to local chieftains. Yet slowly, across centuries, they moved from scattered tribes toward the shape of kingdoms. Their story was not one of sudden birth, but of gradual gathering, a people drawn together by the pull of common identity. The foundation of their unity lay in language. Though tribes were many and scattered, they spoke dialects of the same Thracian branch, close enough to allow communication, trade, and shared tales. Songs sung in one valley could be understood in the next, and the stories of heroes and gods carried across rivers and mountains. This shared speech formed a bridge of belonging. Where language exists, memory is preserved, and with memory comes the recognition of kinship. The Getae and Dacians knew they were not Greeks, not Celts, not Scythians, but something of their own, a people tied to land and tongue. Religion deepened these bonds. The cult of Zalmoxis, with its promise of immortality, spread across the tribes, binding them with a shared vision of life beyond death. The tale of the prophet who vanished into the earth and returned alive was told in villages from the Danube to the Carpathian ridges. Warriors were taught that when they fell in battle, they did not perish, but simply crossed into another world, a realm where their souls would live on. This faith gave them a unity that went beyond politics, a spiritual certainty that knit together peoples otherwise divided by clan or region. Ritual feasts, sacrifices, and ceremonies in mountain sanctuaries reminded every tribe that they belonged to a larger whole. Burial customs, too, revealed the threads of a common culture. Across the land, great tumuli, earthen mounds, rose over the graves of chiefs and warriors. Within these mounds lay weapons, ornaments of gold, and vessels of pottery, offerings for use in the afterlife. The designs carved into jewelry and weapons echoed from one region to another, spirals, knots, and animal forms that spoke the same symbolic language. These patterns told of a shared worldview, one that linked the living to the unseen, the human to the divine, and tribe to tribe. Daily life also carried markers of this shared identity. Dacian and Getic villages, whether in valleys or on fortified hilltops, displayed the same forms of architecture, houses of timber and clay, arranged around central courtyards where families gathered. Pottery carried distinctive motifs, simple yet recognizable, linking scattered communities by style. Weapons bore the curved falx, a blade so feared that even Rome would later redesign its armor to resist it. Such details, small though they seemed, formed the texture of a culture, binding communities through repetition of form and function. The transition from tribe to kingdom was not inevitable, nor was it smooth. Rivalries between clans often erupted in raiding and bloodshed. Yet, in times of crisis or opportunity, chieftains rose who could command more than their own households. Through strength in battle, skill in negotiation, or prestige in ritual, they gathered followers from beyond their kin, forging alliances that pointed toward larger political structures. These leaders could demand tribute, direct labor for building fortresses, and enforce laws that extended beyond a single village. What began as temporary alliances hardened, in time, into the outlines of kingdoms. Trade played its part in this transformation. Greek colonies along the Black Sea coast became points of contact, bringing not only goods, but also new ideas of kingship, coinage, and organization. Dacian chiefs who controlled routes of salt, amber, and gold could accumulate wealth and distribute it to loyal followers, strengthening their authority. Celtic migrations also left their mark, introducing new styles of ornament, improved ironworking, and influences in religion and art. Rather than breaking the tribes apart, these encounters spurred them to define themselves more sharply, to gather under stronger leaders who could harness outside influences for internal power. The Getae, in particular, were noted by Greek historians as unusually organized among the Thracians. Strabo described them as the most just and noble of the northern tribes, their laws guided not merely by force, but by custom and belief. They were disciplined in war, swift horsemen, and formidable infantry, united by faith and by fearsome courage. When Herodotus wrote of the Getae resisting Persian conquest, he remarked on their stubborn bravery and their refusal to yield even against overwhelming odds. Such accounts suggest that, already by the 5th century before Christ, these tribes were more than loose bands. They were communities bound by shared ideals and prepared to act as one. The Dacians, close kin of the Getae, followed a similar path. Their mountain fortresses, with stone walls and sanctuaries, reveal planning and central authority. These were not the works of wandering clans, but of organized societies capable of mobilizing labor and resources on a large scale. Priests and warriors together guided their people, religion reinforcing the authority of kings. A ruler could claim divine sanction, presenting himself not merely as chief, but as chosen intermediary between gods and men. This union of sacred and secular power gave Dacian leaders an aura that extended beyond the reach of their swords. Step by step, the scattered tribes of the Carpathian cradle began to recognize themselves as part of a larger unity. It was not yet a nation, not yet a kingdom in the full sense, but the seeds had been planted. Language, faith, burial rites, art, and weaponry all spoke the same story. Though villages might quarrel and clans might feud, they belonged to a single cultural family. And in times of danger, when empires pressed across the Danube or raiders swept in from the steppes, they could come together, fight together, and see themselves as one. This movement from tribe to kingdom was fragile, often undone by ambition or division. Yet it was also resilient, born of shared memory and the shaping hand of their land. The Carpathians and the Danube had cradled them, but it was their common spirit that allowed them to imagine something beyond tribal walls. The Getae and Dacians were heirs of Thracian blood, but they were also becoming something distinct, a people ready to claim their place in history. What began as scattered villages was becoming a power that empires would one day have to reckon with. A people united not only by necessity, but by the conviction that they were chosen by their gods and rooted in their mountains forever. High in the Carpathian ridges, where mist clings to the forests and rivers cut through valleys like silver threads, the Dacians nurtured a belief that set them apart from nearly every people of the ancient world. They believed death was not an ending, it was a passage. At the heart of this faith stood a mysterious figure known as Zalmoxis, both prophet and god, teacher and legend, who gave the Dacians their fiercest strength, the conviction that to fall in battle was not to perish, but to live forever. The stories told of Zalmoxis begin in obscurity. Some Greek writers claimed he had once been a man, perhaps a slave, who had travelled to far lands, learned wisdom from philosophers, and returned to his homeland with teachings of the soul's immortality. Others insisted he was no mortal at all, but a deity born from the mountains themselves, a god who dwelled beneath the earth and returned to the surface to instruct his people. Whatever the truth, the legend held that Zalmoxis vanished from human sight, retreating into an underground chamber for 3 years. His followers mourned him as dead, until he suddenly reappeared, alive and radiant, declaring that death could not touch those who believed. Whether myth or memory, this tale carried a power that reshaped Dacian identity. To the Dacians, Zalmoxis was not a distant god perched on an unreachable throne. He was a presence in their daily lives, a figure who walked among them, who had conquered death and returned to prove that immortality was real. His teaching became the foundation of their spiritual world. Life on earth was brief, but the soul endured. Every feast, every ritual, every burial mound whispered this truth. Warriors who lifted their forks in battle did so with certainty that even if their bodies fell, their spirits would rise to join Zalmoxis in the world beyond. This faith gave the Dacians a reputation that terrified their enemies. When Persian armies marched north across the Danube, they encountered tribes who fought with reckless courage, refusing to yield even against overwhelming force. Herodotus marveled at these people, noting that they considered themselves immortal and scoffed at death. To soldiers of empires, trained to weigh risks and calculate survival, the Dacians seemed almost inhuman, fighting as though wounds and death meant nothing. Belief had transformed them into warriors whose spirit was as sharp as their steel. The rituals of this faith were woven into the fabric of society. Sacrifices were made to Zalmoxis, sometimes of animals, sometimes of men, offered as messengers to the divine. Ancient accounts describe how the Dacians would choose one among them, cast him into the air upon spears, and if he died swiftly, they believed the god had accepted him. That chosen soul was thought to carry the prayers of the people into the other world. To outsiders, these customs seemed brutal, but to the Dacians, they were acts of faith, a communion between mortal and divine, life and eternity. Priests held great power in this world of belief. They were interpreters of Zalmoxis' will, advisors to kings and guides to the people. They studied the stars from mountain sanctuaries, marking the cycles of seasons and aligning stone circles to the heavens. They declared which days were holy, when war should be waged, when peace should be observed. In their hands, religion and governance were bound together, shaping policy and inspiring obedience. A king might rule by sword, but without the sanction of the priests, his power was incomplete. Together, kings and priests built a society where faith and politics were inseparable, where immortality was not only belief, but also strategy. This vision of life beyond death coloured every aspect of Dacian existence. Burial customs reflected confidence in continuation. Chiefs were interred with weapons, ornaments, and feasting vessels, as though preparing for another life as rich as the one they left behind. Gold cups, iron swords, and carved jewelry were placed in tombs, treasures not wasted, but sent ahead for use in eternity. Even the simplest graves bore signs of faith, small offerings of food and tools to sustain the journey into the unseen. Belief in immortality also encouraged a collective spirit. If death was not to be feared, then sacrifice for tribe and king carried less weight of despair. A fallen warrior was not lost, but joined the eternal company, strengthening the bond between living and dead. Festivals and feasts often invoked the ancestors, who were thought to watch over their descendants from Zalmoxis's realm. The Dacians saw themselves as part of a chain stretching beyond time, each generation linked to those before and those to come, bound together through the immortality of the soul. This faith did not isolate the Dacians from the wider world. It defined how they engaged with it. Traders who brought Greek pottery or Celtic ornaments noticed the strange reverence with which the Dacians spoke of life and death. Envoys from empires struggled to understand a people who treated treaties and threats alike with calm indifference, secure in the knowledge that no earthly ruler could control their eternal fate. The Dacians' reputation for fearless defiance was as much spiritual as it was military, a product of their belief that death itself was an illusion. Yet, this same conviction carried risks. Belief in immortality encouraged courage, but it could also lead to reckless wars. Kings, assured of divine favor, sometimes chose defiance when caution might have preserved strength. Warriors, eager for eternal glory, hurled themselves against impossible odds. The very faith that gave them unity and strength also brought them into conflicts that would one day bring ruin. In this tension lay both the greatness and the tragedy of the Dacians. Zalmoxis, whether prophet, man, or god, left behind more than a legend. He gave a people their identity, their courage, and their hope. The Dacians who gathered in stone sanctuaries and raised their swords against empires did so under his shadow. They were immortals in their own eyes, a nation that believed no chain of death could bind them. And though centuries would pass, though kingdoms would fall, this belief would echo through history, remembered in the accounts of those who marveled at a people who laughed at death. In the end, the Dacians' immortality was not only of the soul, but of memory. Their faith, their courage, and their defiance ensured that their story would not vanish. Zalmoxis had promised them eternity, and in history's pages, that promise lingers still. Along the shores of the Black Sea, where waves broke against harbours filled with foreign ships, the Dacians and their kin, the Getae, came face to face with a very different world. From the 7th century before Christ onward, Greek merchants and settlers established colonies along the western coast of the sea, founding cities such as Histria, Tomis, and Calatis. These settlements were gateways of commerce and culture, places where Mediterranean sophistication pressed against the raw strength of the tribes beyond the Danube. In these encounters, the Dacians discovered new goods, new ideas, and new challenges, shaping their path between trade and conflict. The Greeks came seeking wealth. Their colonies were hungry for grain to feed growing populations, for timber to build ships, for honey, wax, and salted fish to supply distant markets. From the lands north of the Danube, the Dacians and Getae offered exactly these goods. They controlled fertile plains, forests thick with wood, and rivers brimming with life. They also possessed something even more alluring: slaves, captives taken in endless raids against neighbouring tribes. For the Greeks, the northern frontier became a source of riches. For the Dacians, the Greek colonies were both customers and rivals, places to bargain and places to raid. Trade brought more than goods. With Greek merchants came pottery painted with mythic scenes, fine jewellery crafted in delicate styles, an amphorae of olive oil and wine. These luxuries entered the homes of Dacian chiefs, where they stood as symbols of status and power. A golden cup from a Dacian burial mound might carry the shape of Greek artistry, just as a falk's blade traded southward might bear the mark of northern steel. Exchange moved both ways, transforming culture along with commerce. The Dacians adopted coinage from the Greeks, at first using foreign coins, later striking their own with symbols adapted to their beliefs. Diplomacy too was part of these encounters. Greek colonies, though rich, were small enclaves vulnerable to the power of inland tribes. To secure safety, they offered tribute and alliances to local chieftains, inviting them into trade agreements or paying them off to prevent raids. Some chiefs became protectors of certain cities, drawing wealth and prestige from these arrangements. Others viewed the colonies as tempting targets, leading their warriors to strike at coastal settlements when disputes flared. The balance between commerce and violence was delicate, shifting with seasons and with the ambitions of leaders on both sides. Conflict was inevitable. The Dacians, proud and independent, did not easily accept the growing influence of outsiders on their frontier. Raids on Greek colonies are recorded in ancient accounts, and retaliations followed, with Greek mercenaries clashing against tribal warriors. Yet even amid conflict, cultural exchange deepened. Greek influence can be traced in Dacian art, where motifs of lions, griffins, and serpents, long familiar in Greek design, began to appear alongside traditional spirals and knots. In turn, Greek writers took note of northern customs, describing the fierce rituals of the Getae, their belief in immortality, and their willingness to send envoys to the afterlife by casting them upon spears. These encounters shaped identity. The Dacians saw themselves reflected in the eyes of outsiders, described in Greek texts as both noble and savage, a people living close to the gods, yet also quick to violence. To the Greeks, they were fascinating neighbors, difficult to subdue but impossible to ignore. This constant interaction gave the Dacians both access to the wider Mediterranean world and reason to guard their independence with even greater zeal. Religion too crossed the frontier. While the Dacians held firmly to Zalmoxis and the promise of immortality, contact with Greek thought introduced new currents. Philosophers speculated about the similarity between Zalmoxis' teachings and their own ideas of the soul's eternity. Some even claimed Zalmoxis had studied among the Greeks before returning to the north. Whether true or not, such tales reveal how deeply the Dacian faith impressed outsiders, enough to invite comparison with the greatest schools of the Mediterranean. For the Dacians themselves, these parallels may have strengthened their conviction that their ways were as profound as any southern philosophy. The ports of the Black Sea became meeting grounds for cultures. Markets bustled with foreign tongues, where Greek sailors bartered with Dacian traders over sacks of grain and jars of honey. Ships carried news of distant wars and rumors of empires rising in the south, tales that traveled up the Danube into Dacian villages. Warriors who once fought only their neighbors now heard of Persian kings and Macedonian conquerors. The horizon of the Dacians widened, their world no longer confined to mountains and valleys, but connected to the grand currents of history. Yet with connection came danger. The wealth of the Greek colonies tempted not only local tribes, but also great powers. The Macedonians under Philip, and later Alexander, looked to the north, aware of the resources and warriors that dwelled there. For the Dacians, encounters with the Greeks were thus a prelude to even greater struggles. By trading with Greek merchants and clashing with Greek garrisons, they learned both the opportunities and the perils of dealing with civilizations far larger than themselves. What remained constant was the Dacians' fierce independence. They took what they needed from outsiders, coinage, art, and certain technologies, but they never surrendered their core. Their language endured, their faith in Zalmoxis remained unbroken. Their mountain fortresses continued to rise against the sky. Contact with Greece refined them, tested them, and prepared them, but it did not erase them. The Dacians became more aware of the world beyond their borders, yet they stood firmly as themselves, rooted in their land, certain in their immortality, and ready to face whatever forces came across the Danube. In the end, these encounters were not merely exchanges of goods or clashes of swords. They were moments when two worlds touched, each leaving marks upon the other. Greek amphorae buried in Dacian tombs, Dacian weapons carried into Greek wars, myths that crossed cultural lines, all these spoke of a frontier alive with both tension and possibility. For the Dacians, the Greeks were teachers, rivals, and mirrors. In trading with them, fighting them, and learning from them, the Dacians took another step toward the destiny that awaited, a destiny that would soon bring them into conflict, not just with neighbors, but with empires determined to test their strength. The northern horizon of the Dacians was never quiet. Beyond the Carpathians stretched the endless steppe, a sea of grass rolling toward the dawn, and from that sea poured peoples who lived upon horseback and carried war in their saddlebags. These were the Scythians first, later the Sarmatians, and with them came raids, alliances, and influences that reshaped the way the Dacians fought and thought of themselves. To live in the Carpathian cradle was to feel the shadow of the steppe, a shadow that brought both terror and transformation. The Scythians were already legends when Greek historians wrote of them. They were nomads, archers, and riders who lived in wagons and measured wealth in horses. To sedentary peoples, they seemed both alien and unstoppable, striking without warning, retreating before armies could catch them, leaving behind fields of fire and corpses. By the 5th century before Christ, Scythian riders had swept across the northern Black Sea plains, pressing against Thracian and Dacian tribes. Their arrows, loosed from powerful short bows, fell like storms upon enemies unused to fighting from horseback. Their speed gave them control of wide frontiers, and their reputation for cruelty ensured terror preceded them wherever they rode. For the Dacians, contact with the Scythians was not a single moment but a long frontier experience. Sometimes the Scythians came as raiders, crossing rivers to burn villages and seize herds. Sometimes they came as allies, joining Dacian chiefs in campaigns against rival tribes or against Greek colonies along the coast. At other times they came as mercenaries, selling their arrows to those who could pay. Each encounter carried lessons, and the Dacians learned them well. They studied the steppe way of war, borrowing techniques and adapting them to their own rugged land. The most obvious influence was in cavalry. The Dacians had long been skilled riders, but contact with the Scythians honed this skill into a more central part of their warfare. Horses became not only tools of travel, but instruments of battle. Dacian warriors armed themselves with long spears for charges, bows for ranged attack, and the curved falx for close combat. The mobility of mounted warfare allowed them to strike with greater speed, harass enemies in open plains, and retreat before stronger forces could corner them. What had once been the advantage of nomads became part of Dacian strength. The Sarmatians, who began pressing westward from beyond the Don River in the 4th and 3rd centuries before Christ, brought even sharper lessons. They were more heavily armed than the Scythians, their warriors encased in scale armor, their horses protected with barding of leather and metal. These were the first true cataphracts, armored cavalry capable of smashing through infantry lines with unstoppable momentum. When they clashed with Dacian forces, the impact was devastating, but it also taught the Dacians the importance of adapting. Against heavily armored riders, the Dacians perfected the use of the falx, that deadly two-handed blade with a hooked curve, able to pull down shields, pierce armor, and drag riders from saddles. Steppe armor met mountain steel, and the phalanx became both weapon and symbol of Dacian resistance. Beyond tactics, the presence of nomads shaped Dacian strategy. Raids from the steppe were unpredictable, forcing the Dacians to strengthen their hilltop fortresses and refine their system of watchtowers and signal fires. Villages learned to retreat quickly to high ground when horsemen appeared on the horizon. Fortifications became stronger, built of stone and earth, with wooden palisades ready to withstand sieges. The Dacians did not abandon their mountains, but they learned to fight on plains when needed, using mobility to counter mobility, cunning to match speed. There was also exchange beyond battle. Trade. With the Scythians brought new goods, fine horse gear, decorated with gold plaques bearing animal motifs, and distinctive jewelry in steppe style. Some Dacian burials show Scythian influence in weapons and ornaments, proof that contact was not only hostile, but also cultural. Stories and rituals too may have crossed the frontier. The Scythians held fierce beliefs in the afterlife, burying their kings with horses, servants, and treasures for use in eternity. The Dacians, already convinced of immortality through Zalmoxis, may have found echoes of their own faith in these practices, deepening the sense that death was no end but a continuation of life's struggle and honor. The shadow of the Scythians also gave the Dacians a new reputation in the wider world. To the Greeks, the peoples beyond the Danube were already fierce, but the fusion of mountain resilience and steppe ferocity made them even more formidable. Dacian warriors carried both the endurance of their rugged homeland and the swiftness of the horsemen they had learned to imitate and resist. By the 3rd century before Christ, they were no longer seen as merely one of many Thracian offshoots, but as a people distinct, sharpened by their encounters with the nomads of the steppe. Yet the relationship was never simple. At times, Dacian chiefs sought alliances with Sarmatian bands, using their cavalry in wars against other tribes or against encroaching powers. At other times, they were locked in bitter conflict, defending valleys and rivers from devastation. This constant tension kept the Dacians in a state of vigilance, never allowed to grow complacent. Their enemies came not only from across mountains, but also from the endless grasslands, swift and merciless. Survival demanded adaptation, and the Dacians proved again and again that they could learn from foes as well as from friends. The influence of the steppe peoples stretched even into Dacian art and symbolism. Animal motifs common among the Scythians, stags, eagles, wolves, found echoes in Dacian ornament. The wolf, already sacred to their culture, grew even stronger as a symbol, embodying the cunning, speed, and ferocity needed to face enemies who struck without warning. Some scholars suggest that the Dacian dragon standard, a serpent-bodied banner ending in a wolf's head, carried echoes of steppe traditions while remaining distinctly Dacian in spirit. In this way, the shadow of the nomads entered even the sacred symbols of identity. The long centuries of contact with Scythians and Sarmatians did more than teach the Dacians how to fight. They shaped a mindset, a readiness to face threats from every direction, an understanding that survival required both strength and flexibility. When Rome one day looked across the Danube and measured the people who dwelled beyond, it saw not only farmers and mountaineers, but warriors tempered by centuries of frontier struggle, men who had faced the fury of the steppe and endured. Thus, the Scythian shadow was both curse and blessing. It brought devastation, raids, and fear, but it also brought knowledge, resilience, and new ways of war. The Dacians did not vanish under the pressure of horsemen. Instead, they absorbed the lessons, forged their own style, and prepared for challenges far greater than steppe raids. In learning to resist the nomads, they hardened themselves for the coming storm of empire, when legions rather than horsemen would cross the Danube to test their strength. The first encounters between the Dacians and the power of Rome did not come with the thunder of great armies, but with cautious steps across the restless waters of the Danube. For centuries, that river had been a boundary, a line between the world of empires to the south and the wild, half-known lands of forests and mountains to the north. Rome, like Greece and Macedonia before it, could not resist peering across that frontier. In the late 3rd and early 2nd centuries before Christ, as Rome's dominions spread ever deeper into the Balkans, her legions began to meet the warriors of Dacia. At first, these meetings were not wars of conquest, but brushes along a contested border. Roman governors of Macedonia and later of Moesia led expeditions northward, testing the strength of the tribes who watched from the Carpathian hills. The Dacians were not passive. They had already grown seasoned by battles with Celts, Scythians, and Sarmatians. They knew the tactics of horsemen and the ways of defending their mountain citadels. Now they faced something new. The disciplined ranks of the Roman legion, soldiers drilled to move as one, with shields locked and javelins flying in deadly unison. To the Romans, the Dacians were both a threat and an opportunity. Their lands were rich in resources, their mines gleaming with iron and gold, their fertile valleys feeding large populations. Their raids across the Danube into Roman-held territories of Moesia proved costly, forcing Rome to send punitive expeditions. Yet at the same time, their ferocity impressed Roman commanders. To defeat such warriors meant glory. To subdue their lands meant wealth. From the earliest clashes, it was clear that Rome and Dacia were destined for a long struggle. The Dacians fought differently from the enemies Rome was used to. Their weapon, the falx, curved like a hook, could cleave through shields and helmets, leaving Roman soldiers stunned by the brutal force of its blows. Their warriors charged with a recklessness rooted in their belief in immortality, a fearlessness that unnerved even hardened legionaries. Roman discipline gave them the advantage in open fields, but in the thick forests and steep valleys of the Carpathians, Dacian tactics of ambush and sudden retreat turned the landscape into a weapon. Many times Roman columns that thought themselves victorious found themselves harassed and bled dry by unseen foes striking from the shadows of trees or rocks. Greek historians recorded with fascination how the Dacians combined ferocity with spiritual conviction. Herodotus had once remarked on the immortality of the Getae, their close kin, and by the time Roman armies marched north, that same faith carried into battle. To the Romans, who worshipped gods of war and fate but feared death as the end of mortal achievement, this enemy seemed possessed by something beyond reason. Dacian warriors laughed in the face of wounds, fought to the last breath, and hurled themselves against impossible odds as though death itself were an ally. Such courage made them unpredictable foes, difficult to intimidate or subdue. The first Roman expeditions across the Danube were not decisive. They were raids meant to punish, to show strength, and to remind the tribes that Rome was no ordinary neighbour. Yet, these efforts revealed the difficulty of controlling the north. Roman victories won in open battles often crumbled in the aftermath, as supply lines stretched thin and Dacian fighters melted into hills, only to return once the legions withdrew. To Rome, it was a land too costly to occupy fully, but too dangerous to ignore. To the Dacians, it was proof that even the mightiest power of the age could be resisted. As the first century before Christ dawned, Rome's presence in the Balkans grew heavier. After the fall of Macedonia and the establishment of permanent provinces, Roman governors watched the Danube frontier more closely. Clashes became more frequent. Raiding bands of Dacians crossed south, plundering villages and forts, while Roman patrols pushed north, seeking to burn out strongholds. Neither side yet sought total conquest, but each encounter hardened their perception of the other. Rome began to see the Dacians not merely as troublesome barbarians, but as a people with the strength to match great nations. The Dacians, in turn, began to understand that Rome was no passing power like the Celts or Scythians, but a force that intended to stay. It was during this time that the Dacians began to shape their kingdom more deliberately. Strong leaders recognized that unity was essential if they were to stand against Rome. Fortresses in the Urashti mountains grew stronger, sanctuaries more elaborate, and alliances between tribes more stable. The looming shadow of Rome pushed the Dacians toward greater cohesion, forging in them the identity of a kingdom rather than a loose confederation. Every clash across the Danube was not just a test of arms, but a test of survival, a reminder that their future depended on strength and unity. For the Romans, these first encounters were lessons as well. They learned to fear the falx and eventually adapted their armor to withstand its power, adding protective strips of iron to helmets and greaves. They learned to respect the speed and cunning of Dacian cavalry, often drawn from steppe traditions, and the stubborn resilience of Dacian infantry. They also learned that conquest north of the Danube would never be easy. The Yaita River itself was a barrier, and beyond it lay a land of mountains, forests, and warriors who did not fear death. Though no great wars yet raged, the seeds of future conflict had been sown. The Dacians had met Rome, tested Rome, and survived. Rome had gazed across the Danube and seen both wealth and danger. Each side marked the other in memory. Each encounter, each raid, each skirmish was a spark added to the fire that would one day blaze into full war. The first encounters were, in truth, a prelude. Rome was rising, its power stretching from Spain to Asia, its legions seasoned by victories against Carthage, Macedonia, and Gaul. The Dacians were still forming, their identity hardened by their gods, their mountains, and their wars with nomads. When these two powers finally collided in full, it would not be a skirmish across a river, but a struggle that shook the foundations of both. But in these early days, when legion met falx along the Danube frontier, history itself seemed to pause, as if the world were holding its breath for the battles yet to come. In the 1st century before Christ, when the great empires of the Mediterranean struggled with civil wars and shifting alliances, a figure rose in the shadowed valleys of the Carpathians who would give the Dacians their first true king. His name was Burebista, and under his hand a people long divided by valleys, kinship feuds, and rival chieftains were bound together into a single force. His reign was brief in the span of history, but it shone with such brilliance that even the Romans, masters of the known world, looked across the Danube and felt unease. Before Burebista, the Dacians were strong but scattered. They had warriors who terrified their neighbors, fortresses in the mountains that withstood invasion, and faith in immortality that gave them courage beyond reason. Yet they lacked unity. Tribe fought tribe, chiefs squabbled over tribute, and rivals weakened themselves with constant raiding. Outsiders took advantage of this disunity, demanding tribute from one clan while attacking another. What was needed was a leader with vision, someone who could turn the fractious tribes into a kingdom. Burebista appeared at just such a time. Little is known of his early years, but when he rose, he did so with the dual authority of a warrior and a reformer. He was not merely a man of the sword, he was guided by a priest named Dacians, a figure of great wisdom who became his counselor. Together, they wove a new order for the Dacians, combining religious renewal with political unity. The people were called to abandon drunkenness and idleness, to live disciplined lives devoted to their gods and their homeland. Priests preached the will of Zalmoxis, and warriors swore loyalty not only to their chiefs, but to the greater cause of a Dacian kingdom. With faith and law as his foundation, Burebista moved swiftly. He broke the power of rival leaders, bringing tribes beneath his authority by force if persuasion failed. Those who resisted his vision were crushed, their strongholds dismantled, their warriors slain or absorbed into his armies. Those who accepted his rule found themselves part of something larger than they had ever known. For the first time, the Dacians were united under a single king. This unity transformed them. Armies that had once been small bands of raiders became vast hosts capable of marching in ordered ranks. Fortresses that had stood alone were now linked in a chain of defenses and communication. The falx, the curved blade of the Dacian warrior, now gleamed in the hands of tens of thousands who fought not only for clan, but for kingdom. The old symbols of tribe gave way to the dragon standard, the wolf-headed serpent banner that snapped in the wind as a sign of one people under one rule. The power of Burebista grew so quickly that neighboring peoples felt its weight. To the south, the Greek colonies of the Black Sea, long accustomed to balancing between tribes, now faced the pressure of a unified Dacian kingdom. Burebista moved against them, subduing cities such as Histria and Dionysopolis, bringing their wealth into his grasp. To the west, he clashed with the Celts who had once dominated parts of the region, driving them out and expanding his territory. To the east, he pressed against the Scythians and Sarmatians, proving that even the horsemen of the steppe could be checked by his disciplined armies. At its height, Burebista's realm stretched from the Black Sea in the east to the plains of Pannonia in the west, from the Carpathians in the north to the Balkan Mountains in the south. It was a kingdom vast and formidable, larger in reach than any Thracian or Dacian power before it. For the first time, the tribes who had once been scattered across forests and valleys were spoken of as a nation, a force that rivaled the greatest powers of the age. The Romans took notice. During this same time, the Roman Republic was riven by civil war, with Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great locked in a struggle for supremacy. Burebista's kingdom stood in the middle of these conflicts, a wild card whose allegiance could tip the balance. Both sides courted him, seeking alliance, for they knew that the strength of Dacia was not to be ignored. Some sources even claim that Caesar planned a great campaign against Burebista, intending to crush this rising power before it grew too strong. But Caesar's assassination in the year 44 before Christ ended those plans. Fate, it seemed, shielded the Dacians for a little while longer. Burebista himself did not outlive Caesar by much. In that same year, his own nobles, perhaps fearful of his power or driven by rival ambitions, turned against him. He was assassinated, and the kingdom he had built was divided among his successors. The unity he had forged dissolved as quickly as it had been made, the tribes once again drifting back into rivalry. Yet the memory of what he had achieved did not vanish. Burebista's reign, though short, left an indelible mark. He had proven that the Dacians could be more than scattered tribes. He showed them that with unity, discipline, and faith, they could form a kingdom capable of challenging empires. The reforms he and Dacianus introduced, especially the moral and religious discipline tied to the worship of Zalmoxis, endured long after his death. His campaigns expanded the Dacians' horizons, teaching them to think not only of village and valley, but of nation and destiny. Even in death, Burebista's shadow stretched long. Rome never forgot the danger he had posed, and in later generations, when the Dacians again rose under great leaders like Decebalus, the Romans would remember the precedent of Burebista and treat the Dacian threat with utmost seriousness. For the Dacians themselves, his name became a symbol of what was possible when their people set aside division and embraced unity. Burebista's story is the story of a people glimpsing their own potential. For a moment, the scattered voices of the mountains spoke as one. The warriors fought under a single banner, and the Dacians became a kingdom to be feared. Though the dream fractured with his death, it remained alive in memory, a vision of what could be. In the centuries that followed, as Rome's power rose and the Danube frontier grew ever more contested, that vision would guide the Dacians again, inspiring them to rise once more against the mightiest empire the world had ever known. At the height of his reign, Burebista transformed Dacia from a collection of mountain tribes into what some ancient writers called the Empire of the Carpathians. For a brief but brilliant moment in the 1st century before Christ, he ruled a realm that stretched from the Black Sea to the plains of Pannonia, from the northern Carpathian forests to the hills above Thrace. No Dacian before him had wielded such power, and no Dacian after would match the breadth of his dominion. His kingdom stood as both a marvel and a threat, a frontier empire born not from centuries of gradual growth, but from the will of a single man and the faith of a people who believed they were immortal. Central to Burebista's rise was his partnership with Dacianus, the priest who became his guide and counselor. Together, they fused religious reform with political unity. The old vices that weakened tribal life, drunkenness, feuds, idleness, were condemned and driven out. Burebista famously ordered the destruction of vineyards, seeing wine as the root of disorder and weakness. To the Dacians, whose festivals had long revolved around drink, this command must have seemed severe, yet it was obeyed. Discipline replaced indulgence, and from this new austerity rose a stronger, more focused people. The kingdom became a society of warriors and farmers, bound together by belief in Zalmoxis and loyalty to their king. With this moral and religious foundation, Burebista turned his eyes outward. He understood that a united Dacia could not remain inward-looking. The world beyond the Danube was filled with both threats and opportunities, and he sought to master them all. To the west, Celtic tribes still roamed, remnants of the migrations that had once shaken Europe. Burebista struck them with relentless force, driving them from their strongholds and breaking their power. In the lands of modern Slovakia and Hungary, the Celts were crushed or absorbed, their weapons and artistry taken into the Dacian realm. Where once the Celts had been masters, now they bowed before the wolf standard of Dacia. To the south, the Greek colonies along the Black Sea coast felt the weight of his armies. For generations, these cities had balanced between Thracians, Scythians, and Macedonians, trading wealth for safety. Under Burebista, that balance ended. His armies descended upon them, seizing cities such as Histria, Dionysopolis, and Olbia. Some were subdued by force, others by threat, but all came under Dacian control. This conquest gave Burebista access to ports, trade, and the prestige of ruling Greek-speaking populations. It also drew the attention of Rome, for the Black Sea coast had always been of interest to Mediterranean powers, and now it was firmly in Dacian hands. To the east, the Scythians and Sarmatians, those lords of the steppe, were driven back. Their raids into Dacian lands were answered with decisive campaigns that broke their dominance along the lower Danube. By defeating the horsemen of the plains, Burebista secured his eastern frontier and proved that even the feared nomads could not match the unity and discipline of his kingdom. These conquests expanded not only territory, but also resources. Dacia became rich in grain, herds, timber, and, most importantly, metals. Gold from the Transylvanian mines, iron from the Carpathian veins, and salt from the earth filled his coffers. Burebista knew that wealth alone could not hold power, but in his hands it became the fuel for a state. He redistributed land, rewarded loyalty, and ensured that his armies were well equipped. Fortresses were rebuilt and strengthened, sanctuaries expanded, and networks of watchtowers spread across the mountains, binding the realm together in a way no tribal confederation had managed before. The structure of his rule was both traditional and revolutionary. At its core, Dacian society remained tribal, with local chiefs wielding authority over their clans. Yet Burebista bent those chiefs to his will, demanding loyalty to him above all. Priests under Decianus reinforced this order by declaring his rule sanctioned by the gods. Thus, religion and kingship became inseparable. Every victory was seen as divine favor, every law as sacred duty. To disobey the king was to defy both ruler and God. The reforms imposed under his guidance reshaped daily life. The ban on wine, though harsh, reduced drunken feuds that had long weakened the tribes. Agricultural labor was organized more efficiently, ensuring that food supported the growing population and armies. Warriors trained under stricter discipline, their courage sharpened by faith but directed by order. In effect, Burebista transformed the Dacians from fierce but disunited fighters into a war machine capable of taking on empires. The image of this empire of the Carpathians struck both fear and wonder into the ancient world. Strabo, the Greek geographer, marveled at the reach of Burebista's power, noting how he ruled over a people once scattered, now united into the strongest force north of the Danube. Even the Romans, who prided themselves on being unconquerable, took his threats seriously. Julius Caesar himself, in the final years of his life, planned a great campaign against Burebista, intending to crush this northern kingdom before it grew too strong. That such a plan was even conceived shows how formidable the Dacians had become. Fate, however, would intervene. In the year 44 before Christ, both Caesar in Rome and Burebista in Dacia were struck down, one by daggers in the Senate, the other by the betrayal of his own nobles. The dream of the empire of the Carpathians ended almost as swiftly as it had begun. Without his commanding presence, the fragile unity of the tribes shattered, and the kingdom split into fragments ruled by rival leaders. The vast conquests of Burebista were lost, and the Dacians returned to disunity. Yet his reforms and his vision left a mark that could not be erased. The memory of unity, the knowledge of strength, and the belief that the Dacians could stand as an equal to Rome endured in the minds of his people. Later kings, most notably Decebalus, would draw upon that memory, seeking once more to bind the tribes into a kingdom capable of resisting empire. Burebista's empire was brief, but it was transformative. In less than 2 decades, he raised a people from scattered tribes to the peak of regional power. He disciplined them through reform, strengthened them through faith, enriched them through conquest, and united them under one banner. Though his life ended in treachery and his empire crumbled, the vision he left behind shaped the destiny of the Dacians for generations. The empire of the Carpathians was not built to last, but it proved what was possible, and for that reason alone, its shadow stretched far beyond the lifetime of its king. The fall of Burebista was as sudden as his rise, and it revealed the fragile foundations upon which even the mightiest kingdoms are built. For nearly 2 decades, he had stood as the unchallenged ruler of a realm that stretched farther than any Dacian leader before him could have imagined. His word was law, his reforms had reshaped society, and his armies had brought neighbors to heel. Yet in the year 44 before Christ, the same year that Julius Caesar fell beneath the daggers of his own senators in Rome, Burebista too was struck down, betrayed by his closest nobles, undone not by foreign conquest, but by the very men who had once raised him to power. The reasons for his assassination remain shrouded in shadows, pieced together from hints in later accounts. Some say that his strict reforms had bred resentment among the elite, especially the ban on wine, which struck at both personal pleasure and economic interests. Others point to his consolidation of power, which reduced the authority of tribal chieftains and left them little more than local administrators beneath his royal command. In a world where loyalty was fragile and ambition constant, such centralization created enemies as surely as it created order. Whatever the motives, the end was decisive. Without warning, the king who had united a nation was murdered, and with him died the fragile unity of the Dacian world. The timing of his death was uncanny, for across the Danube, Rome too was reeling from the murder of its most famous leader. Caesar had already begun preparations for a campaign into Dacia, recognizing the threat that Burebista's growing empire posed. The Roman world was stunned by Caesar's assassination, but the Dacians were equally stunned by the sudden loss of their king. 2 great leaders, one in the south and one in the north, fell in the same year, leaving behind unstable realms and uncertain futures. Fate had conspired to change the destiny of nations in a single stroke. The consequences of Burebista's death were immediate and devastating. His empire, so carefully built through conquest, reform, and spiritual authority, fractured almost overnight. Without his commanding presence to hold the tribes together, old rivalries resurfaced. Local chiefs reclaimed independence, carving the kingdom into pieces. Ancient sources speak of the Dacian realm being split into 4, and later even 5 distinct parts, each ruled by ambitious leaders, with little interest in unity. What had been a formidable power capable of challenging Rome became a patchwork of small competing states, vulnerable to external pressure and internal strife. This fragmentation was not merely political, but also cultural. The priests who had supported Burebista's vision struggled to maintain authority in the absence of a central king. Some continued to preach his reforms, while others bent to the will of local chieftains, who sought to revive older traditions. The wine ban, once strictly enforced, was abandoned in many regions, as local elites sought to restore their wealth and influence. Religious unity fractured alongside political unity, and the great vision of a disciplined, spiritually focused nation gave way to the familiar chaos of tribal independence. Rome, ever watchful, recognized opportunity. Though Caesar's death threw the Republic into civil war, the long-term effect of Burebista's fall was to remove a dangerous northern rival. Where once the Romans had considered a major campaign across the Danube, they now saw no need. A divided Dacia posed no immediate threat. Instead, Roman commanders focused their efforts on internal struggles and on the Mediterranean world, content to let the Dacians tear themselves apart. Yet the memory of Burebista lingered in Roman minds. They had seen what a united Dacia could achieve, and they never forgot it. The lesson would shape Roman policy for generations to come. For the Dacians themselves, the loss of unity meant a return to constant insecurity. The Celts, who had survived Burebista's earlier campaigns, attempted to reclaim lost ground, raiding and resettling in border regions. The Sarmatians and other nomadic peoples once more pressed against the Dacian frontiers, testing the strength of fractured tribes. Greek colonies along the Black Sea coast, freed from the heavy hand of Burebista's rule, sought alliances elsewhere, often looking south to Rome or west to Macedonia for protection. Dacia, once feared, had become vulnerable again. The legacy of betrayal weighed heavily upon the Dacian people. In their songs and stories, the memory of Burebista remained as both inspiration and warning. He was remembered as the king who had brought greatness, who had shown what unity could achieve, but also as a tragic figure undone by those closest to him. His fall served as a lesson about the dangers of ambition and division, a lesson that would echo through Dacian history until the time of Decebalus generations later. And yet, even in decline, the dream did not die. The fortified sanctuaries he had built remained as symbols of what had once been possible. The stories of his victories over Celts, Scythians, and Greeks were passed down, inspiring future leaders to try again. Though his empire did not survive him, the memory of his reign carved itself into the identity of his people. They had once stood as equals to Rome, and they might do so again. The irony of Burebista's end is that he had been preparing for the greatest challenge of all, the clash with Rome. His kingdom had grown strong enough to warrant Caesar's attention, and the stage was set for a conflict that might have changed the course of European history. But neither man lived to see it. Instead, both were struck down by betrayal in the same year, and the collision of their two powers was delayed by decades. In the end, the fall of Burebista was not merely the death of a king, but the unraveling of a vision. His assassination opened the door to fragmentation, Roman opportunism, and renewed vulnerability. Yet it also left behind a legacy of what could be achieved when the Dacians stood as one. The dream of unity would resurface again and again, each time challenged by the forces of ambition, foreign power, and fate. The empire of the Carpathians had ended, but its shadow would never fade. The death of Burebista and the shattering of his realm coincided with the chaos that tore Rome apart in the middle of the 1st century before Christ. It was an age when the Danube frontier became not merely a line on a map, but a stage where the ambitions of emperors, generals, and kings collided. The Dacians, once the rising threat under their great unifier, now found themselves weakened and fragmented, yet their lands remained too rich, too strategic, and too dangerous to be ignored. In the vacuum of Burebista's death, the tribes of the Carpathians became both pawns and players in the great Roman civil wars, caught between giants but never entirely silenced. The Roman world itself had fallen into turmoil after Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon and began the march that would topple the old republic. His victories over Pompey and the Senate's armies shifted the balance of power across the Mediterranean, and beyond those borders, every tribe and kingdom watched carefully, waiting to see who would rise supreme. Dacia, sitting just north of Macedonia and Thrace, could not help but feel the tremors of this struggle. Roman armies marched and countermarched across the Balkans, fleets fought in the Aegean, and everywhere alliances shifted like sand. When Caesar triumphed over Pompey at Pharsalus in the year 48 before Christ, he seemed unstoppable. Yet even he recognized that a strong Dacia under Burebista might have posed a serious obstacle to his plans of expansion eastward. His assassination in the year 44 before Christ ended that danger, but it also meant that the Dacians had to contend with a new Roman reality. A world where the Great Republic had no single master, but many rivals. The Dacians, now divided into several small kingdoms after Burebista's assassination, each pursued their own path in this uncertain age. Some sought alliance with Rome, hoping to gain protection and trade from whichever general happened to hold the upper hand. Others looked to exploit Roman distraction, raiding across the Danube and testing the weakened defences of Thrace and Macedonia. For Rome's generals, the Dacians were both nuisance and opportunity. They could be courted as allies, recruited as mercenaries, or punished as raiders depending on the needs of the moment. The civil wars gave the Dacians glimpses of both promise and peril. The defeat of Pompey and his flight eastward brought Roman attention briefly away from the Danube, giving local kings space to maneuver. Yet when Marcus Antonius, one of Caesar's closest allies, took command of the eastern provinces, the Dacians once more found themselves under scrutiny. Antonius sought to secure the frontier, knowing that instability there could spill south into Macedonia and undermine his power. Skirmishes across the Danube became frequent, and some Dacian chiefs offered men to his cause in exchange for recognition. Meanwhile, the slow rise of Octavian, soon to be Augustus, reshaped the balance of power yet again. As Octavian and Antonius competed for dominance, the Dacians observed carefully, aware that whichever side prevailed would dictate their fate. The Dacians had no illusions of controlling Rome's destiny, but they could tilt the balance along the frontier. Both sides courted their favor, promising wealth and autonomy in exchange for loyalty. The tribes, pragmatic and opportunistic, often pledged support to one Roman faction, while secretly preparing to shift allegiance if the tides of war turned. The Battle of Philippi in 42 before Christ, where the forces of Antonius and Octavian defeated the assassins of Caesar, further entrenched Roman influence near Dacia. Veterans of the campaign were settled in colonies across Macedonia and Thrace, strengthening Rome's presence along the frontier. These colonies served not only as strongholds, but also as reminders to the Dacians that Rome's power, though fractured, still reached across the mountains and rivers that guarded their lands. As the rivalry between Antonius and Octavian deepened, the Danube frontier became both shield and weapon. Antonius, whose attention drifted toward Egypt and his alliance with Cleopatra, relied on diplomacy and occasional raids to keep the Dacians quiet. Octavian, more cautious and deliberate, preferred to secure the border through colonies, fortifications, and treaties. For the Dacians, this difference of style was crucial. Antonius allowed them more freedom to raid and expand, so long as they did not threaten his strategic interests. Octavian, however, began the slow process of drawing the frontier into the orbit of Rome, preparing for the day when no independent Dacian king would remain. The clash at Actium in 31 before Christ marked the turning point. With Antonius and Cleopatra defeated, Octavian stood alone as master of Rome, soon to be hailed as Augustus, the first emperor. For the Dacians, this was both the end of opportunity and the beginning of a new era of pressure. Rome was no longer distracted by civil war. Its energies, once divided between rival generals, could now be directed outward once again. Augustus understood the importance of securing the Danube frontier, and he made it one of his early priorities. The Dacians, however, were not yet ready to submit. Fragmented as they were, they remained proud, fierce, and wealthy. Their mines still produced gold and iron, their forests timber, and their herds filled the valleys. Roman merchants sought their goods, but Roman legions feared their raids. In this uneasy balance, the frontier hardened into a zone of both trade and war. Treaties were made and broken, skirmishes erupted, and ambassadors crossed the river as often as soldiers did. What the civil wars had truly given the Dacians was a taste of their own significance. They had seen Roman generals court their alliance, bribe their leaders, and fear their raids. They had realized that, though divided, they could still shape the fortunes of empires. And though Augustus would soon impose greater order upon the frontier, the memory of Rome's weakness lingered. The Dacians knew that Rome was not invincible, that even the mightiest, republic or empire could be torn apart by ambition and betrayal. Thus, in the shadow of the Roman civil wars, the Dacians learned to play the game of survival between giants. They were no longer the united empire of Burebista, nor yet the conquered people of Trajan's future triumphs. They were something in between, fractured but fierce, vulnerable yet dangerous, always watching and waiting for the moment when the river might once again be crossed, and the balance of power might shift in their favor. The story of Dacia in this era is one of adaptation. The Romans tore themselves apart in civil war, and the Dacians, though weakened by their own divisions, endured. They became opportunists on the frontier, sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, always a presence that Rome could not ignore. And as Augustus transformed the Roman world into an empire, the Dacians too were transformed. Not conquered, not yet, but forced to reckon with the reality that they lived beside a power that would not rest until the Danube flowed only through Roman lands. The death of Burebista had left a kingdom vast in memory, but fragile in reality. His empire of the Carpathians had been born of discipline, vision, and the weight of a single man's authority. Once that authority was removed by betrayal, the unity he had imposed unraveled with astonishing speed. The Dacians, who only a generation before had marched under one banner, now found themselves ruled by kings without unity, men who claimed the mantle of leadership but could not command the loyalty of all tribes. What followed was an age of political fragmentation, rivalry, and growing vulnerability to powers beyond the Danube. Ancient sources tell us that after his assassination, Burebista's kingdom was divided into at least 4 parts, and some say even 5. Each portion was ruled by a successor who claimed to inherit his strength, yet none possessed his charisma or his ability to command universal obedience. The tribal chiefs, who had once bent reluctantly to his centralizing rule, now seized the chance to reclaim independence. Their loyalty had been born not of love, but of fear and necessity, and without Burebista's towering presence, old rivalries resurfaced. The dream of a single Dacian state gave way once more to a patchwork of petty realms. One of the most striking consequences of this division was the loss of coordinated defense. Burebista's strength had been his ability to marshal warriors from across the Carpathians, to turn scattered fighters into an army capable of facing Celts, Scythians, and even the prospect of Roman invasion. Now, when raiders crossed the borders or neighboring peoples tested Dacian's strength, responses were local and uncoordinated. A tribe might defend its valley fiercely, but another might stand aside, unwilling to risk blood for a neighbor's cause. The unity that had once made the Dacians formidable evaporated, leaving them exposed to both foreign attack and internal decay. The kings who emerged in this fractured age each ruled from regional centers of power. Some looked toward the Black Sea, seeking to hold the Greek colonies that had once fallen under Burebista's sway. Others controlled the fertile valleys of Transylvania or the fortified heights of the Orishti Mountains. But rather than cooperating, these rulers competed, each trying to outshine the others in power, wealth, and prestige. Alliances were temporary, betrayals common, and the dream of a united Dacian kingdom faded further with each passing year. This instability did not go unnoticed by their neighbors. The Celts, long beaten back by Burebista's armies, tested the borders once again, slipping into the vacuum left by his absence. The Scythians and Sarmatians on the steppe launched raids, plundering undefended villages and herds. Even within Dacia itself, rival chiefs plundered each other's lands, turning warriors upon fellow Dacians rather than upon foreign enemies. The strength that had once been turned outward now dissolved inward, consuming itself in rivalries and blood feuds. The greatest danger, however, came from the south. Rome had always watched the lands beyond the Danube with wary eyes. When Burebista was alive, Rome feared his power enough that Caesar himself had contemplated a campaign against him. But with his death and the splintering of his kingdom, Rome saw opportunity rather than danger. During the years of civil war that followed Caesar's assassination, Rome had been too consumed with its own struggles to press the advantage. But once Octavian, soon to be Augustus, emerged as sole master of the Roman world. The frontier across the Danube became a subject of renewed attention. Roman governors in Macedonia and Moesia saw the disunity among the Dacians and began to exploit it. Some Dacian chiefs were courted with gifts and promises, others threatened with force. Trade was used as both lure and leash, for the Dacians depended on Roman merchants for luxury goods, wine, and metalwork. By supporting one king against another, the Romans ensured that no single ruler could achieve the kind of dominance that Burebista once held. The Dacians became entangled in the politics of empire, their weakness serving Roman interests as surely as their unity once had posed a threat. The religious unity that had been enforced under Burebista and his priestly advisor Decianus also began to crumble. Local shrines that had been suppressed under the great king were revived. The ban on wine, once a symbol of discipline, was abandoned in many regions. Priests no longer spoke with one voice, but served the rival courts of competing kings. The belief in immortality and the courage it inspired in battle did not vanish, but without central authority, it lost its unifying force. The Dacians remained a spiritual people, but their religion no longer bound them into a single destiny. It is striking to imagine what might have been had Burebista lived longer, or had a successor of equal strength risen to take his place. The Dacians might have met Rome as a united power at the height of its transition from republic to empire. Instead, they faced Augustus and his heirs as a people divided, their strength sapped by rivalry. This fragmentation would shape the next century of their history, making them alternately dangerous raiders and vulnerable subjects, but never the masters of their fate as they had been for that brief shining moment under their great king. Yet even in this age of disunity, the memory of Burebista lingered. His reign had shown what was possible, and that vision haunted the fractured tribes. Songs and stories of his conquests, his reforms, and his victories over Celts and Greeks were passed down. Ambitious leaders dreamed of restoring his empire, of uniting the tribes once more and standing against Rome as equals. The failure of his successors to achieve that dream did not erase the desire. It smouldered, waiting for the day when another strong king might rise from the Carpathian heartland to rally the Dacians into one people again. For now, however, the Dacians lived in an age of kings without unity. Their lands were rich, their warriors fierce, their culture resilient, but their divisions made them prey to the ambitions of others. Rome would never forget the lesson of Burebista's power, and Rome would never again allow a Dacian king to wield such strength unchecked. The price of betrayal in 44 before Christ was not only the death of one man, but the scattering of a nation, and it would take generations before the Dacians would find a leader capable of mending what had been broken. Out of the long shadows left by Burebista's fall and the generations of disunity that followed, a new figure rose who would restore to the Dacians both fear and respect among their enemies. His name was Decebalus, and though he came to power in an age when Rome was at its height, he proved himself more than capable of turning weakness into strength. Where other kings had failed to hold the tribes together, Decebalus bent them once again into a single force, guided by his cunning, patience, and vision. He was not merely a warrior, but a strategist, a man who understood that survival against an empire required more than courage. It required guile. The story of Decebalus begins in the last decades of the 1st century after Christ, when the Dacians found themselves pressed from every side. Roman power under Domitian had extended deep into the Balkans, and legions stationed along the Danube stood ready to strike northward. Meanwhile, the Sarmatians and other steppe tribes threatened from the east, and internal rivalries continued to sap Dacian strength. The people longed for a leader who could defend them, one who might rekindle the vision of unity that had been shattered since Burebista's time. Into this need stepped Decebalus, a chief whose skill in battle and sharp intelligence quickly drew the loyalty of allies. He first proved himself in wars against neighboring tribes, showing both bravery and an ability to read the battlefield. Unlike many leaders who rushed blindly at the enemy, Decebalus used deception, ambush, and terrain to his advantage. He learned from both victories and defeats, crafting a style of leadership that combined the ferocity of the Dacian warrior tradition with the calculation of a seasoned general. His reputation spread, and gradually he was recognized as the most capable leader among the fractured clans. When he rose to the throne around the year 87 after Christ, he inherited a kingdom at once vulnerable and resilient. The Dacians had rich lands, formidable fortresses in the Oresti Mountains, and warriors hardened by generations of conflict. But they also faced the overwhelming power of Rome, whose emperors now looked northward with suspicion and hunger. Decebalus knew that open defiance would invite destruction, but he also knew that submission would strip the Dacians of their pride and independence. His challenge was to balance between these extremes, to resist Rome without provoking total annihilation. The name Decebalus itself carries meaning, often translated as the brave or the strong, and yet his true strength lay not only in bravery, but in intellect. Roman writers, even hostile ones, admitted his cunning. They described him as shrewd in negotiation, skilled in laying traps, and capable of turning disaster into opportunity. He studied Rome as carefully as Rome studied him, learning the weaknesses of its legions and the vanity of its emperors. He understood that the Dacians could never defeat the empire in a single pitched battle, but they could bleed it, harass it, and exhaust it until compromise became more useful than conquest. One of his earliest tests came against the forces of the Emperor Domitian. In the late 80s, the Romans launched a campaign across the Danube, seeking to punish Dacian raids and secure the frontier. At first, the legions gained ground, but Decebalus turned the rugged landscape of his homeland into a weapon. Narrow valleys became killing grounds where Roman formations could not maneuver. Dense forests concealed ambushes, and sudden strikes left columns bloodied and retreating. At the Battle of Tapae, Dacian warriors, fighting with their curved falx blades, inflicted heavy losses, forcing the Romans to recognize that this mountain kingdom could not be subdued easily. Domitian, humiliated by defeats elsewhere and eager to secure peace, chose negotiation over annihilation. The result was a treaty astonishing in its generosity. Rome agreed to pay annual subsidies of gold and provide engineers to help the Dacians fortify their defenses. To the empire, it was a temporary expedient. To Decebalus, it was a triumph. He had forced mighty Rome to pay tribute, turning its wealth and knowledge to his own advantage. With Roman engineers, he strengthened fortresses like Sarmizegetusa, making them nearly impregnable. With Roman money, he enriched his warriors and secured loyalty among the tribes. In this way, Decebalus transformed a precarious kingdom into one of the most formidable powers along the Danube. The ability to unify the tribes was perhaps his greatest achievement. Dacian society was famously fractious, with chiefs jealously guarding their independence. Yet under Decebalus, rivalries were set aside in the face of a larger cause. His victories against Rome and the riches he secured through diplomacy gave him prestige no rival could match. The priests, invoking the old traditions of Zalmoxis, lent their blessing, declaring his leadership divinely favored. Warriors flocked to his banners, not only for plunder, but for the chance to defend their homeland under a leader who seemed destined for greatness. Still, unity did not mean peace. Decebalus continued to raid Roman territories, testing the frontier and reminding the empire that Dacia could not be contained. Each raid brought back wealth and captives, fueling the Dacian economy and further strengthening his authority. Yet each strike also increased Roman determination to destroy him. The uneasy balance could not last forever. Roman historians later painted Decebalus as both a formidable enemy and a cunning deceiver, a man who tricked Domitian and mocked Roman pride. But their scorn was edged with respect. They recognized that he had achieved what few others had. He had forced the greatest power in the known world to treat him as an equal, at least for a time. The peace he won was not the peace of submission, but the peace of strength, a pause in which he could prepare for the inevitable storms to come. As the first century drew to its close, Decebalus stood at the height of his power. He had rebuilt a fragmented people into a kingdom once again feared on both sides of the Danube. His fortresses rose strong upon the mountains, his warriors sharpened their curved blades, and his name carried weight in the courts of emperors. Yet he knew, as did his people, that Rome would not tolerate the insult of tribute forever. A new emperor, more ambitious and less forgiving than Domitian, would one day march north to end Dacia's independence. For the moment, however, the Dacians had their king, and in him they found more than a ruler. They found a symbol of resilience, a man who proved that the legacy of Burebista had not been lost. Decebalus had emerged from the chaos of kings without unity to bind the tribes once more, and in doing so, he set the stage for one of the greatest struggles in the long and bloody history between Rome and the peoples beyond its borders. The clash between Rome and Dacia in the last decades of the first century, after Christ was born out of pressure, fear, and ambition on both sides of the Danube. Rome, under the rule of the Emperor Domitian, sought to reassert control over a frontier that had become a source of unrest. The Dacians, led by their rising king Decebalus, saw opportunity in Rome's distractions and weaknesses. What followed was a violent prelude to the greater wars of the future, a series of campaigns marked by humiliation for the empire and glory for the mountain kingdom that dared to defy it. Domitian's reign had begun in uncertainty. He inherited a vast empire, but not the military prestige of his father Vespasian or his brother Titus. To strengthen his position, he looked to the frontiers, hoping victories would secure both the loyalty of the army and the respect of the people. Trouble in the Danube provinces gave him just such an opportunity. The Dacians had begun to raid Roman territory, striking into Moesia and threatening Roman settlements. For Domitian, this was both a challenge and a chance to prove himself. In the year 85 after Christ, the first major Dacian incursion crossed the Danube. Roman garrisons were caught off guard, and the governor of Moesia was killed in the fighting. Panic spread across the region, for the Dacians, hardened in their mountain strongholds, proved themselves no ordinary raiders. Their curved falk swords could cut through shields and armor. Their ambush tactics made the forests and valleys deadly, and their courage, rooted in the belief that death was not an end, shook Roman discipline. Domitian responded quickly, marching north with legions to punish the Dacians. Yet he underestimated both the ferocity of the enemy and the treacherous geography of the Carpathian frontier. In open ground, the Roman legions were unmatched, but in narrow passes, on steep ridges, and in forests where visibility was measured in yards, the Dacians turned the land itself into a weapon. At the Battle of Tapai, Roman columns advancing into the mountains were struck from the flanks and above. Dacian warriors, hidden until the last moment, poured down upon them, their falx blades smashing through helmets and shields. The Romans, disciplined though they were, found themselves in chaos. The defeat was severe, and it marked the beginning of a struggle that would shake Roman pride. To mask the embarrassment, Domitian celebrated a triumph in Rome, as though he had won a victory. But the truth was harder to hide. The Dacians had not been crushed. They had humiliated the empire. Domitian's generals, stung by the setback, prepared new campaigns. Legions were reinforced, fresh supplies brought forward, and efforts made to adapt Roman equipment to withstand the deadly falx. Stronger helmets with bars across the face and reinforced shields were introduced, evidence that Rome had been forced to learn from defeat. Still, the Dacians were not idle. Decebalus used the time to strengthen his position. Roman engineers, sent as part of peace negotiations, were compelled to aid in fortifying the great strongholds in the Orashti Mountains. Sarmizegetusa, perched high in the hills, became a fortress city of stone walls, towers, and hidden water channels, With Roman gold, Decebalus paid his warriors, secured the loyalty of rival chiefs, and even attracted foreign craftsmen who improved Dacian arms and defences. In this way, the very empire that sought to destroy him instead helped to prepare him for greater resistance. A second campaign launched in the year 88 after Christ fared somewhat better for Rome. Once again, the Battle of Tapai was fought, this time with the Romans managing to hold the field. But though the legions advanced, they could not penetrate deep enough to strike at the Dacian heartland. Terrain, weather, and supply lines stretched too thinly prevented decisive victory. Meanwhile, revolts in other provinces demanded attention, forcing Domitian to pull back before the war could be won. The emperor's frustrations grew, and his solutions turned toward negotiation. Decebalus, ever shrewd, played the part of a cooperative king when it suited him, but he extracted extraordinary concessions. Rome agreed to pay annual tribute, not as the price of peace, but as a bribe to avoid war. Even more astonishing, Roman advisors and engineers were sent to aid in strengthening Dacian defences, a decision that later Roman writers mocked as folly. For the Dacians, it was nothing less than a triumph. They had forced the greatest empire of the age to pay for their survival and to help fortify their realm. This uneasy peace, secured in the closing years of Domitian's reign, was fragile and humiliating for Rome. Many senators seethed at the thought of gold flowing northward into the hands of barbarians. Generals grumbled at the stain upon Roman honour, yet the truth was undeniable. Decebalus had outmaneuvered the emperor. He had fought Rome to a standstill, inflicted defeats upon its legions, and then secured terms that enriched and strengthened his kingdom. For the Dacians, these years were ones of renewal. Fortresses rose stronger than ever, weapons were sharpened, and confidence grew. The tribes, long divided, now saw in Decebalus a leader who not only united them but humbled Rome itself. His prestige soared, and loyalty to him deepened. Even rival chiefs, who might once have resisted his authority, now accepted his rule, for he had proven himself chosen by both fate and the gods. But in Rome, the humiliation lingered. The uneasy peace might have bought time, but it also ensured that future emperors would one day return to the Danube with vengeance in their hearts. The shame of tribute could not be forgotten, and the stain on Roman honour demanded cleansing. The peace of Domitian was no true peace at all, but merely a pause before the storm. Thus, the prelude to war was set. Decebalus, secure in his mountains and enriched by Roman gold, prepared for the next challenge. Rome, its pride wounded but its resources vast, waited for a stronger hand upon the imperial throne. Soon, under a new emperor, the empire would march again, not for tribute, but for conquest. And when it did, the stage would be set for one of the fiercest struggles Rome would ever face beyond its frontiers, a war that would decide the fate of Dacia itself. High in the Orashti Mountains, where the forests cloak the ridges and the valleys twist like a labyrinth, there once stood the heart of the Dacian kingdom. Its name was Sarmizegetusa, a place that was more than a capital, more than a fortress. It was the soul of a people, a citadel of stone and faith, a stronghold that embodied both the power and the spirit of the Dacians. To understand why Rome so feared and so coveted Dacia, one must first understand what Sarmizegetusa represented. The capital was not a single city, but a complex of fortresses, sanctuaries, and settlements, all carefully positioned within the shelter of the mountains. The terrain itself was a weapon, steep slopes and narrow passes guarding every approach. From the heights, sentinels could see for miles, watching for the first sign of an enemy column struggling up the winding paths. The mountains protected the Dacians as surely as walls, but within those mountains, they built something that turned nature's strength into human design. The fortifications of Sarmizegetusa were remarkable even to the Romans, who prided themselves on their engineering. The Dacians developed a style of construction known as murus dacicus, a wall built of massive stone blocks with wooden beams running through them, filled with earth and rubble to create walls of immense thickness and resilience. These walls encircled the high places, forming layers of defense that could withstand siege engines and resist fire. Terraces carved into the slopes allowed for multiple lines of fortifications, so that even if one was breached, defenders could retreat higher and continue the fight. Inside the walls lay the beating heart of Dacian power. Here stood the sanctuaries, great circular structures of stone that marked the Dacians' devotion to their gods. The most famous of these was the Great Circular Sanctuary, a ring of stone pillars aligned with precision, evoking both a calendar and a temple. To the Dacians, it was a sacred space where the divine touched the earth, where priests spoke with the voice of Zalmoxis, and where rituals bound the people together in shared belief. Around it stood other sanctuaries, squares and circles of stone that may have served as astronomical observatories, ritual spaces, or symbols of cosmic order. To the Romans, these sanctuaries seemed strange, even alien, but to the Dacians, they were proof that their kingdom was chosen, guided by gods older than Rome itself. Samizegatusa was not only a place of worship, but also a center of governance and wealth. Within its fortresses, the kings of the Dacians kept their treasures, gold mined from the mountains, silver, and ornaments that testified to both power and prosperity. Workshops produced weapons and tools, while craftsmen shaped jewelry and ornaments that blended local traditions with influences from Greeks and Celts. Roads linked the capital to the wider kingdom, allowing tribute and resources to flow inward, strengthening the center of power. Yet the importance of Samizegatusa was not merely practical, it was symbolic, the visible expression of Dacian identity. To rally the tribes was never easy in a land where independence was prized, but Samizegatusa gave them a common focus. Here was the place where chiefs gathered to swear loyalty, where priests declared divine approval of their kings, where warriors prepared for campaigns, and where victories were celebrated. It was the memory of Burebistas' dream preserved in stone, the promise that the Dacians could be more than scattered clans, that they could be a nation. When Decebalus rose to power, he recognized the importance of Samizegatusa and strengthened it further. With the tribute he extracted from Domitian, he expanded the fortifications, repaired sanctuaries, and built hidden channels to ensure water would never fail during siege. Roman engineers, sent as part of peace agreements, unwittingly added their knowledge, making the Dacian capital a fortress of both native ingenuity and borrowed science. By the time of Trajan, Samizegatusa was one of the most formidable strongholds in the known world, a mountain citadel that seemed untouchable. To the Romans, Samizegatusa became both a challenge and an obsession. They knew that as long as the fortress stood, Dacia could not be subdued. Campaigns could burn villages and seize borderlands, but the heart of the kingdom would remain strong behind its walls. Roman writers would later describe it with awe, noting its sanctuaries, its fortresses, and the wealth hidden within. For them, to destroy Samizegatusa was not merely to win a war, but to break the spirit of a people. For the Dacians, the city was the opposite, a living symbol of endurance. Each stone, each terrace, each sanctuary reminded them that they were more than tribes clinging to survival. They were heirs of a sacred tradition, guardians of mountains and rivers, chosen by gods who promised immortality. Samizegatusa was their Jerusalem, their Rome, their holy place and capital combined. In times of peace, the stronghold bustled with activity. Merchants brought goods from the Black Sea colonies, caravans carried salt and grain, priests conducted rituals, and the king's court planned campaigns and diplomacy. In times of war, the atmosphere shifted. Weapons were stockpiled, walls were manned, and fires burned through the night to signal readiness. Songs of courage echoed from the sanctuaries, prayers for divine favor were offered, and the warriors believed that as long as Samizegatusa stood, the Dacians could never truly be defeated. This faith would be tested in the years to come. For when Rome, under Trajan, finally turned its full might against Dacia, it was not enough to win battles in the valleys or seize outlying fortresses. The empire would march again and again into the mountains, each time pressing closer to the capital. Only when Samizegatusa itself fell would Rome claim victory. And when it did, the fall would mark not just the loss of a fortress, but the shattering of Dacian independence, the extinguishing of a dream preserved in stone for generations. But before that final reckoning, Samizegatusa stood as the greatest achievement of the Dacians, their fortress of faith and war, their symbol of unity. To speak of Dacia without speaking of this mountain capital is to miss the essence of their power. For in its walls and sanctuaries, in its terraces and secret springs, the spirit of a people was carved into the earth itself. As long as its stones held firm, the Dacians believed, so too would their kingdom endure. When Trajan became emperor of Rome at the dawn of the 2nd century after Christ, he inherited more than an empire at peace. He inherited a wound to Roman pride, inflicted by a mountain kingdom that had humbled legions and forced Rome to pay tribute. That kingdom was Dacia, ruled by Decebalus, whose cunning and strength had turned Domitian's campaigns into embarrassment. Trajan was not a man to accept humiliation. He was a soldier emperor, hardened by campaigns in Germany and Parthia, and he resolved that the stain of Dacian defiance would be wiped away once and for all. The result was the First Dacian War, a brutal struggle fought between the years 101 and 102 after Christ, which would mark the beginning of Rome's fiercest contest beyond the Danube. The decision to invade was not taken lightly. Trajan knew that Dacia was no ordinary enemy. The kingdom was defended not only by mountains and forests, but by fortresses of stone, sanctuaries that gave its warriors divine courage, and a leader who had already outwitted Roman generals. Yet Trajan also knew that Dacia's wealth, its gold and silver mines, could enrich the empire beyond measure. To conquer Dacia would bring not only security, but also fortune and eternal glory. Preparation was immense. Roman engineers built roads and bridges across the Danube, the most famous being Apollodorus's bridge, a marvel of stone and timber that allowed legions to cross the river in force. Supplies were gathered from every province, and legions from Spain, Gaul, Syria, and the Danubian provinces were drawn into the campaign. This was no punitive raid, but a full-scale invasion, planned with the precision of empire. In the spring of 101, the legions marched north. The advance was relentless, the standards of Rome glinting under the sun, as thousands of soldiers crossed into Dacian lands. Trajan himself led the army, determined to oversee the war that would define his reign. The first clashes came in the valleys near Tupae, where Decebalus had once inflicted humiliation on Domitian's forces. Now, once again, the Dacians stood ready. The battle that followed was ferocious. Dacian warriors poured down from the ridges, their curved falx blades slicing through Roman armor, their war cries echoing through the forest. For a time, the discipline of the legions seemed to falter under the ferocity of the attack. But Trajan had prepared well. His men fought in tighter formations, their helmets reinforced against the falx, their shields stronger. Slowly, Roman discipline ground down Dacian fury. The field was littered with the fallen, and though the Dacians fought with unmatched courage, they were forced to retreat into the mountains. The Romans pressed forward, but the war was far from won. Decebalus used the land itself as his weapon, retreating into fortresses that clung to the mountain ridges, striking with ambushes and raids that bled Roman columns. The Orashti Mountains became a labyrinth of resistance, and every advance was paid for in blood. Roman siege engines battered at stone walls, while Dacian defenders rained down missiles and sallied forth in sudden charges. For months, the campaign became a test of endurance, with neither side yielding easily. Trajan's advantage lay in persistence. He refused to be drawn into traps, refused to abandon the siege even when supplies ran thin. Roman engineers carved roads into cliffs, hauled siege towers up steep slopes, and built camps that slowly tightened the noose around Dacian strongholds. Step by step, the legions advanced towards Samizegatusa, the capital that symbolized Dacian independence. By the end of 101, the pressure forced Decebalus into desperate measures. He sought alliances with neighboring peoples, hoping to open new fronts against Rome. The Sarmatians, longtime rivals of both Rome and Dacia, were drawn into the conflict. The war widened, stretching Roman forces thin. For a time, it seemed as though the Dacians might turn the tide. In the early months of 102, the struggle reached its climax. Trajan divided his forces to strike both at Dacia and its allies. Battles raged across the frontier, with Roman cavalry clashing against Sarmatian horsemen, while legions continued their assault on the mountain fortresses. The campaign was brutal, marked by slaughter, fire, and devastation. Villages were burned, fields destroyed, and thousands were killed or enslaved. It was war in its most merciless form, a struggle not just for land, but for survival. At last, facing relentless pressure, Decebalus sued for peace. He had not been destroyed, but he had been beaten back. The terms imposed by Trajan were severe. The Dacians were forced to surrender war machines, to demolish fortresses, and to accept a Roman garrison within their lands. Decebalus himself was left on the throne, but now as a client king, bound by Rome's will. It was a victory for Trajan, one that restored Roman pride and brought him honor in the eyes of the Senate and the people. Yet beneath the surface, the war was not finished. Decebalus remained on his throne, still cunning, still dangerous. Though beaten, he had not been broken, and in his heart he prepared for the day when he would rise again. For the Romans, the First Dacian War was a triumph, celebrated in monuments and coins, but it was also a warning. Dacia had not yet been subdued, and the mountain stronghold of Samizegatusa still stood, proud and defiant. Trajan returned to Rome in triumph, hailed as a conqueror, his name celebrated across the empire. But the legions knew, and Decebalus knew, that this peace was only an interlude. The blood spilled in the valleys of Tapai, the smoke rising from the mountain fortresses, the uneasy terms of client kingship, all pointed toward another reckoning. The First Dacian War had restored Rome's honor, but it had not ended the struggle. The mountains still held their king, and the Dacians still dreamed of freedom. Thus, the War of 101 to 102 was remembered not only as a Roman victory, but as the beginning of a greater conflict. Trajan had proven that Rome could strike deep into the Carpathians and win. Decebalus had proven that Dacia could survive even against the greatest power on earth. The stage was set for the second, greater war, a struggle that would decide not only the fate of a king, but the fate of a nation. The war had ended, but the mountains of Dacia still held their king, and his spirit had not been broken. In the year 102 after Christ, the First Dacian War came to its uneasy conclusion, sealed by a treaty that bound Decebalus to Rome, but left both sides unsatisfied. To Trajan, it was a victory, celebrated with triumphal arches and the cheers of the people. To Decebalus, it was a pause, a bitter concession extracted under pressure, but one that he intended to twist to his own advantage. The peace that followed was peace only in name, for beneath it smouldered quiet defiance and the certainty that another reckoning would one day come. The terms of the treaty were harsh, designed to clip the wings of a proud kingdom. Dacia was forced to surrender its war engines, ballistae, catapults, siege machines that had been captured or built in imitation of Roman models. Several fortresses were to be dismantled, their walls torn down so they could no longer serve as bastions of resistance. A Roman garrison would be stationed in Dacia, a constant reminder that Decebalus was no longer free, but bound as a client king under the shadow of empire. Tribute was imposed, a humiliating acknowledgement of Rome's dominance. To the outside world, it seemed that Dacia had been reduced to a protectorate, its independence swallowed by the iron grasp of Trajan's Rome. Yet Decebalus remained on his throne. Unlike other defeated kings whom Rome had dragged away in chains, he was left to rule his people, his crown still on his head, his capital still standing in the Oriste Mountains. This was the brilliance of his defiance. By yielding just enough, he preserved the core of Dacian sovereignty. To his people, he remained their king, the man who had faced Rome and survived. To Trajan, he was now a client bound by treaty, but one who could be watched and, if need be, destroyed at a later time. In Rome, the peace was hailed as a great achievement. After the humiliations under Domitian, Trajan's war had restored pride. The Senate declared him Optimus Princeps, the best of rulers, and the people celebrated his triumph with feasts and games. Coins bore images of Dacia subdued, and artists carved scenes of Trajan's victory into monuments. Rome believed the frontier had been secured, the threat contained, the wild mountain tribes finally brought to heel. But in the hills of Dacia, the story was told differently. Decebalus was no broken king. He accepted the treaty, yes, but he did not live by it. The fortresses that were supposed to be dismantled were often left standing, their walls secretly repaired or strengthened under the cover of forest and stone. Tribute was paid to Rome, but it was balanced by the tribute of conquered neighbors, seized in raids that continued despite the treaty's terms. Roman engineers sent to aid in reconstruction were welcomed, their knowledge quietly absorbed, and their skills turned not only to peaceful works, but to strengthening Dacian defenses. Decebalus understood Rome's arrogance. He knew that Trajan, basking in glory, would not immediately return with his legions. He also knew that the empire's frontiers stretched across half the known world, and that distractions would come, from Parthia in the east, from restless provinces, from the endless churn of imperial politics. In that space of time, he prepared. He stockpiled weapons, recruited warriors, and rebuilt what the treaty had supposedly broken. The peace was Rome's illusion, and he meant to use it. It is here that we see the genius of Decebalus. He was not merely a warrior, but a survivor. Where other kings might have resisted until crushed, he bent just enough to endure. Where others might have surrendered completely, he concealed his intentions beneath outward compliance. To Rome, he smiled and nodded. To his people, he whispered of freedom yet to be won. He played the double game with skill, buying time and strength until the moment was right. The years that followed were filled with uneasy calm. Roman garrisons along the Danube watched Dacia carefully, their scouts reporting movements, their officers wary of raids. In Rome itself, voices in the Senate muttered that Trajan's settlement had left the enemy too strong. But the emperor, occupied with consolidating power elsewhere, allowed the treaty to stand. For a time, the arrangement seemed to work. Trade flowed across the river, merchants exchanged goods, and envoys crossed back and forth with words of friendship. Yet beneath the surface, suspicion poisoned every gesture. The people of Dacia, though proud of their king's resilience, bore the burden of the treaty. Tribute drained resources, Roman oversight limited independence, and the humiliation of subordination stung deeply. Yet their loyalty to Decebalus remained firm, for they saw in him not weakness, but defiance. He had faced the mightiest empire in the world, and lived. He had bent the treaty into a tool rather than a chain. They believed he would one day deliver them from Rome's grasp, and he fed that belief with careful words and deliberate actions. Peace, at such a price, was never destined to last. Rome had gained honor, but not security. Dacia had lost freedom, but not hope. Both sides knew the balance was temporary, a pause before the storm returned. In the mountains, Decebalus rebuilt. In Rome, Trajan planned. The treaty was not an ending, but a fragile interlude, a space where each side gathered strength for the greater conflict yet to come. Thus, the peace of 102 was remembered not as a lasting settlement, but as a deception. On one side, a mask of triumph, on the other, a mask of submission. Between them lay an unspoken truth. The war was not over. It had only been postponed, and when it came again, it would be fiercer, bloodier, and final. The uneasy peace that followed the First Dacian War never ran deep. In the valleys of the Orashti Mountains, Decebalus rebuilt his power, repaired fortresses, and gathered allies, all while bowing outwardly to Rome's demands. In Rome itself, Trajan celebrated his victory, but he knew that the treaty had left the Dacians too strong. Each side waited, prepared, and planned, until at last the balance shattered. In the year 105 after Christ, Rome returned to the Carpathians with an iron resolve, and the Second Dacian War began. This was no border skirmish, no half-hearted campaign. Trajan came with the full weight of empire, determined to finish what had begun. The Roman people, who had cheered his first triumph, expected nothing less than complete conquest. The Senate demanded the humiliation of Decebalus, and the emperor himself hungered for a victory that would echo through history. The war that followed was among the most ambitious military efforts Rome ever undertook, marked by staggering feats of engineering and battles that tested the strength of both nations to the breaking point. The campaign began with preparation on a monumental scale. Roman engineers, led by Apollodorus of Damascus, constructed a bridge across the Danube that astonished even contemporaries. Built of stone piers and timber arches, it stretched for nearly a mile, a permanent gateway for the legions into the Dacian heartland. The bridge was more than a tool. It was a symbol, a declaration that Rome would not merely raid but occupy, not merely punish but destroy. Once the bridge stood, the river that had long been a shield for the Dacians became instead a highway for invasion. The legions that marched across were among the best Rome had ever assembled. Veterans from Gaul, Spain, and the East joined, new recruits from the Danubian provinces. Siege engines followed in their train, towers, rams, and catapults, designed to break even the strongest walls. Supply lines stretched back through the Balkans, secured by roads cut into mountains, and fortified camps built at every stage. It was war conducted not in haste, but with deliberate, overwhelming force. Decebalus, however, was not idle. He had fortified his capital at Samosata into a mountain citadel, its stone walls thick, its sanctuaries guarded, its secret water channels hidden from the eye. His warriors were fierce, armed with their curved falx blades that had already humbled Roman soldiers. He had drawn in allies from among the Sarmatians and other tribes, promising plunder and glory for those who stood against Rome. Though outnumbered, he relied on the land and the courage of his people, hoping to repeat the ambushes and mountain defences that had won him victories in the past. The first clashes came once more at Tarpai, the gateway into the Dacian heartland. The Romans, advancing through narrow passes, were struck by sudden attacks from the ridges, as warriors rained down spears and arrows before charging with ferocious cries. But Trajan had learned from the earlier war. His formations were tighter, his scouts more vigilant, his supply lines better guarded. Slowly, the discipline of the legions prevailed, and the Dacians were forced to fall back deeper into the mountains. The war then became a grim contest of sieges and assaults. Roman engineers dragged siege towers up impossible slopes, building ramps of earth and stone to reach the walls of Dacian fortresses. Catapults hurled stones against walls, while battering rams shook the gates. Inside, the Dacians fought with desperate courage, hurling down rocks, launching arrows, and charging in furious sorties. Time and again, the Romans stormed walls, only to be driven back by the ferocity of the defenders. Villages were burned, fields stripped bare, and blood stained the mountain streams. Trajan himself remained at the front, directing operations with tireless energy. His presence inspired his soldiers, who endured hunger, exhaustion, and endless fighting with the knowledge that their emperor shared their dangers. In Rome, writers would later portray him as the ideal commander, leading by example, unbending in resolve. For Trajan, the conquest of Dacia was not just another campaign, but the defining struggle of his reign. By the year 106, the war reached its climax. The legions, having battered their way through outer defences, advanced toward Samizegatusa itself. The stronghold, ringed by walls of stone and sanctuaries of faith, stood defiant, a symbol of all that the Dacians had built and all that they were. Trajan brought forth every engine of war, surrounding the fortress with towers, rams, and soldiers in endless ranks. The siege was brutal, with the Dacians resisting fiercely at every breach. For weeks the struggle dragged on, until at last Roman engineers discovered and cut the hidden water channels that sustained the defenders. Deprived of their lifeline, the Dacians could no longer hold. The fall of Samizegatusa was a catastrophe for the kingdom. Fire swept through the sanctuaries, smoke rising from the circle of stones where priests had once spoken with the gods. Treasures were seized, fortresses torn down, and thousands of warriors slain. Decebalus fled into the mountains, still refusing to submit, still seeking one last chance to defy Rome. But the noose had closed too tightly. Roman cavalry pursued him, cutting off every escape. At last, surrounded and knowing capture was certain, he chose death on his own terms. With his curved blade, he ended his life, denying Rome the satisfaction of parading him in chains. The Second Dacian War was over. Rome had won not just victory but annihilation. Dacia was no longer a proud mountain kingdom, but a conquered land. Its capital burned, its treasures carried to Rome, its people scattered in defeat. Trajan returned to the city in triumph, celebrated as the greatest conqueror since Augustus, his victories carved forever into the spirals of Trajan's column, where scenes of bridges, battles, and sieges still tell the story in stone. Yet for all its glory, the war was remembered not only for Rome's power, but for Dacia's courage. Few enemies had ever resisted so fiercely. Few kings had fought so cunningly as Decebalus. The price of Rome's victory was immense. Years of bloodshed, staggering costs, and the loss of countless lives. But the empire had gained not only security along the Danube, but also immense wealth from the mines of Dacia, wealth that would fund monuments, games, and the splendor of the Roman capital for generations. Thus ended the Second Dacian War, a conflict that was at once triumph and tragedy, conquest and ruin. For Rome, it was the crowning achievement of Trajan's reign. For the Dacians, it was the end of independence, the breaking of a kingdom, and the loss of a dream that had endured since the days of Burebista. The mountains still stood, the rivers still flowed, but the people who had once defied empires now belonged to one. And in the memory of both Rome and Dacia, the war would live on as a story of might and resistance, of empire and freedom, of a clash that shook the ancient world to its core. The mountains that had guarded the Dacians for centuries had withstood raids, invasions, and endless wars, but in the year 106 after Christ, they faced the full weight of Rome's power. At the heart of those mountains lay Samizegatusa, the fortress city that was more than a capital. It was the beating heart of Dacian identity, a place of kings, warriors, and gods. To strike it down was not only to defeat an enemy, but to erase the very symbol of their independence. And so Trajan, having broken through the outer defences and crushed Dacia's allies, marched his legions toward the stone walls and sanctuaries of the mountain citadel. The siege of Samizegatusa was unlike anything the Dacians had faced before. The Romans came with overwhelming force, with legions hardened by 2 years of campaigning, and engineers who had already dragged siege engines through valleys and over ridges thought impassable. They built ramps of earth and timber up steep slopes, rolling towers bristling with archers to the very edge of the walls. Battering rams thundered against gates reinforced with iron, while catapults hurled stones that crashed down upon the terraces of the fortress. For days and weeks, the air was filled with smoke, dust, and the cries of battle. Inside, the Dacians resisted with the ferocity of desperation. Warriors lined the walls, hurling javelins and rocks down upon the attackers. They rushed from hidden sally ports in furious counterattacks, striking Roman soldiers before retreating back behind the stone. Women and children carried water, repaired breaches, and kept the fires burning. Priests invoked the name of Zalmoxis, assuring the people that even if their bodies fell, their souls would live on. The great circular sanctuary became both a temple and a rallying place, its ring of stones standing as a reminder of divine order in the chaos of war. But Rome's determination was as relentless as its machines. Trajan understood that Sarmizegetusa could not simply be contained. It had to be destroyed. The Romans pressed their siege closer, cutting trenches and surrounding the fortress with camps. When assaults failed, they turned to patience, tightening the noose day by day. Then came the turning point. Roman scouts discovered the secret water channels that had long sustained the capital during sieges. With careful engineering, the legions cut these lifelines, diverting streams and choking the defenders' wells. Deprived of water, Sarmizegetusa began to wither from within. Thirst gnawed at the defenders, weakening even the bravest. Fires could not be quenched, and supplies dwindled. Still, the Dacians held on, hoping for some miracle, some intervention that would spare them. But none came. Rome's grip closed inexorably, and the walls that had once seemed invincible became cages. The sanctuaries where priests had spoken with the gods now echoed with prayers unanswered, their silence heavier than any catapult stone. When at last the Romans broke through, it was not a battle, but a slaughter. The legions poured into the fortress, cutting down defenders who fought to the last. Flames swept through the citadel, consuming houses, workshops, and temples alike. The sanctuaries, those sacred circles of stone that had stood for centuries, were torn down or desecrated, their pillars toppled, their meaning erased by foreign hands. Gold and treasure stored in the capital were seized, hauled away to Rome to fuel monuments and games. The wealth of a kingdom became the spoils of empire. The destruction of Sarmizegetusa was more than the fall of a city. It was the breaking of a people's spirit. For generations, the Dacians had looked to their mountain stronghold as a symbol of survival. As long as Sarmizegetusa stood, they believed, Dacia could endure. With its sanctuaries destroyed, its walls burned, and its treasures taken, that belief crumbled. Resistance flickered in pockets, but the heart of the kingdom was gone. Decebalus himself escaped the fall, slipping away with a small band of followers into the wilderness. He sought to rally what remained, perhaps to wage a final campaign of ambush and defiance. But the Romans pursued him relentlessly, their cavalry scouring the hills and forests. Surrounded and with no hope of escape, he chose to deny Rome its triumph. Rather than endure chains and humiliation in a Roman triumphal parade, Decebalus fell upon his own sword, ending his life in the mountains he had fought so long to defend. His death marked the end of Dacian independence, the final act of a kingdom that had dared to defy the might of empire. For Rome, the fall of Sarmizegetusa was a moment of triumph. Trajan returned to the capital in glory, his victories immortalized in coins and in the spiraling reliefs of his great column. The wealth of Dacia, its mines of gold and silver, flowed into the coffers of the empire, funding monuments, games, and new campaigns. The Senate hailed him as the greatest of emperors, and his name was celebrated across the provinces. For the Dacians, it was the end of a world. The sanctuaries where their gods had been worshipped were rubble. Their king was dead by his own hand. Their capital lay in ashes, its smoke carried on the wind as a dirge for a people broken. Survivors were scattered, some enslaved, some absorbed into the new Roman province, others fleeing into the forests and mountains to live as shadows of their former nation. The independence that had endured through centuries of struggle was gone, consumed in fire and blood. And yet, in memory, the fall of Sarmizegetusa became something more than defeat. It became legend, a story of courage and defiance against impossible odds. The ruins of the sanctuaries, the stones still standing in silent rings, whispered of a people who had once stood proudly against the mightiest empire on earth. Though Rome claimed victory, the spirit of Dacia lived on in the echoes of its mountains, in the songs of its descendants, and in the memory of a king who refused to bow. The fall of Samizegatusa was the final collapse of Dacian resistance, but it was also the moment when their story was etched forever into history. The Romans believed they had extinguished a nation. Instead, they had forged a legacy that would outlast even their own empire. The flames of Samizegatusa still smouldered when the last act of the Dacian kingdom unfolded. Rome had broken through the walls, toppled the sanctuaries, and stripped the stronghold of its treasures. But the spirit of the Dacians still clung to one man, Decebalus, king of the mountains, the warrior who had humbled emperors and bent Rome itself into paying him tribute, refused to surrender. His story did not end in chains, nor in the triumphal parade that Trajan longed to display in Rome. It ended in a final moment of defiance, a death that would be remembered as much as any battle he had fought. When the capital fell, Decebalus slipped away with a handful of loyal followers. The forests and ridges of the Orashti mountains had always been his shield, and he hoped to vanish into their shadows once more. Perhaps he imagined rallying scattered bands of warriors, continuing the struggle through ambush and raid. Perhaps he sought only to escape Roman hands, to live as a fugitive rather than a prisoner. Whatever his plan, the Romans were relentless. Trajan's cavalry, swift and merciless, fanned out across the countryside, hunting him down like prey. Scouts combed valleys and ravines, tightening the noose with every passing day. The pursuit was not merely military, but symbolic. Rome had destroyed the Dacian kingdom, but without the capture of its king, the victory would remain incomplete. Trajan wanted Decebalus alive, to march him through the streets of Rome, to present him in chains before the people, and to carve into stone the image of imperial supremacy. Nothing could better proclaim Rome's triumph than the humiliation of the man who had resisted them so fiercely. And so the hunt pressed on, driven by both vengeance and ambition. At last, the pursuers closed in. Roman cavalry, armoured in gleaming metal, thundered across the hills, driving Decebalus into a narrow valley. Surrounded, exhausted, and with no escape left, the Dacian king faced his fate. To submit would mean degradation, the spectacle of being paraded as a trophy of conquest, his people watching from afar as their king was mocked and displayed. To fight on was impossible, for the odds were hopeless, and so he chose a third path, the one his spirit demanded. As the Romans closed in, Decebalus drew his blade. The same curved falx that had struck terror into the legions was now turned upon himself. In the shadow of the mountains he had ruled, beneath the sky that had watched his victories and defeats, he pressed the steel to his throat and fell upon it. His death was swift, defiant, and unyielding. He had denied Rome its spectacle, robbed Trajan of his prize, and chosen to meet death on his own terms rather than live in dishonour. The scene was recorded by Roman chroniclers, carved forever into the spirals of Trajan's column. There, in stone, one can still see the moment. Decebalus, kneeling with sword in hand, Romans rushing toward him, too late to stop the blow. To Rome, it was both triumph and frustration, the final act of a king who had resisted them to the very end. To the Dacians, it became legend, the death of a warrior who would not bow even when all was lost. The body of Decebalus was taken by the Romans, his head severed and carried to Trajan. In Rome, it was displayed to prove that the king was truly dead, that Dacia had been broken beyond repair. Yet even in death, Decebalus remained defiant. His suicide echoed louder than any parade could have. He had chosen freedom in death over humiliation in life, and in doing so, he had given his people a symbol that would outlast conquest. For Trajan, the death of his enemy secured his triumph. With Decebalus gone, resistance collapsed entirely, and the lands of Dacia were absorbed into the empire as a new province. The mines of gold and silver enriched Rome, veterans settled the conquered territory, and the eagle of the legions flew where once the wolf of the Dacians had howled. Yet even as he celebrated, even as his column rose in the heart of the city, Trajan must have known that the manner of his enemy's death had left a scar on Rome's pride. Decebalus had denied them the spectacle of submission. For the Dacians, the death of their king was not only tragedy, but transformation. In his suicide, they found both despair and dignity. Their kingdom was gone, their sanctuaries burned, their independence lost. But their king had remained unbent to the very end. In death, Decebalus became a symbol of resistance, a story carried in whispers and memories, long after the legions had built their camps on Dacian soil. His blade, turned against himself, was the final assertion of freedom. The fall of Sarmizegetusa had marked the destruction of the Dacian kingdom, but the death of Decebalus marked the end of an age. With him died the last dream of independence, yet with him also was born a legacy that even Rome could not erase. His defiance was carved into stone, sung in the tales of his people, and remembered through centuries as the act of a king who chose death over dishonor. Rome had conquered his land, but it could never conquer the spirit embodied in that final moment. Thus ended the life of Decebalus, king of the Dacians, warrior of the mountains, thorn in the side of empire. His kingdom became a province, his treasures became Rome's spoils, his sanctuaries became ruins, but his death became legend. And in that legend, his people endured, long after the empire that defeated him had itself crumbled into dust. The dust of war had hardly settled when Rome began the slow, deliberate work of transforming Dacia from a fallen kingdom into a functioning province of the empire. The conquest had been costly, and Trajan intended that the rewards should justify the effort. He had not crossed the Danube with bridges of stone and rivers of blood, only to leave the mountains untamed. Dacia was to be remade in Rome's image, reshaped from a land of fortresses and sanctuaries into a province of law, commerce, and imperial order. The first task was control. The legions remained, their camps now permanent fortresses that dotted the landscape like iron outposts. From these bastions, Roman patrols marched along newly cut roads, ensuring that the wolf banners of the Dacians no longer flew. Resistance flickered in pockets, remnants of warriors who had escaped the sieges, but Rome's machine was relentless. Garrisons secured the mines, forts guarded the passes, and bridges spanned rivers where once the forests had offered refuge. Next came the settlers. Veterans of the wars were granted lands as rewards for their service, anchoring them to the soil of this new province. Alongside them came colonists from across the empire: Italians, Gauls, Spaniards, Greeks, Syrians, and others, each carrying with them the language, laws, and customs of Rome. In time, Dacia became a mosaic of peoples, bound together not by ancient tribal loyalties, but by the weight of Roman administration and the allure of Roman prosperity. New cities rose from the ruins of Dacian strongholds. At the site of Sarmizegetusa, Rome planted its capital for the province, Ulpia Traiana Sarmizegetusa. Built in the Roman style with forums, amphitheatres, baths and temples, it proclaimed the triumph of civilization over what Rome had called barbarism. The streets ran straight, the stones set with precision, and the very plan of the city mirrored the order Rome sought to impose upon the land. Other cities followed: Apulum, Napoca, Potissa, each a node of Roman power, each a beacon of the empire's reach. At the heart of Rome's interest lay the mines. The mountains of Dacia were rich with gold and silver, and these resources had fueled Trajan's determination to conquer the land. Now, under Roman control, the mines were expanded, worked with slave labor, and taxed heavily to fill the coffers of the empire. Caravans carried ingots south across the Danube, wealth flowing from the Carpathians to the Eternal City. Rome's economy felt the pulse of Dacia's veins, and Trajan's column in Rome was more than a monument. It was a reminder of the riches his conquest had secured. Romanization spread not only through roads and mines, but through culture. Latin became the language of administration, of trade, of law. Over time, it seeped into daily speech, mingling with local tongues, planting seeds that would grow into new dialects and eventually entire languages. Roman law replaced tribal custom. Contracts, courts, and magistrates governed disputes where once chiefs and warriors had settled matters by blade or blood price. Temples dedicated to Jupiter and Mars rose beside the remnants of sanctuaries once devoted to Zalmoxis. Bathhouses invited locals into the rhythms of Roman leisure, while amphitheatres introduced spectacles of gladiators and beasts that had never before been seen in these mountains. Yet Romanization was never total. In the countryside, among farmers and shepherds, traditions endured. Songs still told of Decebalus. Sacred groves still whispered of older gods, even if their worship was practiced in secret. The peasants clung to customs that Rome's officials neither understood nor always sought to crush. The province was Roman in its cities and along its roads, but beyond them, in valleys and hills, the Dacian spirit lingered, adapted, and survived. The military remained ever present, for Dacia was a frontier province, surrounded by restless peoples who had not been conquered. To the east, Sarmatians still rode across the steppes. To the north, free Dacians and other tribes watched with resentment. The province was both jewel and bulwark, rich in resources but costly to defend. Massive walls, watchtowers, and chains of forts created one of the most fortified regions of the empire, a barrier against the tides of the steppe. Trajan's death did not halt the transformation. His successors continued to develop Dacia, though some questioned whether the province was worth its cost. Hadrian considered withdrawing, as he did from other exposed frontiers, but Dacia's mines were too valuable, and so Rome held on. The cities grew, trade flourished, and for a time the mountains seemed securely bound within the empire's grasp. The impact on identity was profound. The Dacians who remained in the province became provincials of Rome, subjects of the emperor, bound by imperial law and living under Roman administration. Over generations, they adopted Roman dress, Roman names, and Roman ways, yet traces of their ancestors remained. In their speech, in their rural customs, in their stubborn resilience, echoes of the old kingdom survived beneath the veneer of Romanization. The province of Dacia stood as both triumph and contradiction. It was proof of Rome's might, the land won by Trajan's great wars, celebrated in marble and gold. It was a source of immense wealth, feeding the empire with precious metals that glittered in imperial treasuries. And yet, it was also fragile, perched at the edge of Rome's world, costly to defend, and vulnerable to the waves of pressure that would in time sweep across the frontiers. For nearly 2 centuries, Rome clung to Dacia. Roads were paved, cities thrived, and the Latin tongue spread. The children of colonists and locals grew up never knowing a world before Rome, while the mountains whispered memories of Decebalus and the days of independence. The Roman province of Dacia was more than just territory. It was a crucible where empire and native resilience mingled, creating something new. And though the eagle's wings would one day withdraw, the mark left upon the land and its people would endure, shaping identities long after the empire itself had crumbled into ruin. When Trajan returned to Rome after the long and bloody wars in the Carpathian lands, he carried with him more than spoils and prisoners. He carried a story of conquest, endurance, and the power of Rome's destiny. To make sure that tale would never fade, he ordered that it be carved into stone, rising high above the city as both monument and message. Thus was born Trajan's Column, a tower of marble spiraling with scenes that captured, in image after image, the struggle between Rome and the Dacians. The column itself was an engineering marvel. Standing more than 100 feet tall, crowned with a statue of the emperor, it dominated the new forum that Trajan had built in the very heart of Rome. Constructed of massive marble drums stacked with precision, the column seemed to rise effortlessly toward the sky, yet its true power lay not in its size, but in its surface. Winding upward in a continuous band was a frieze stretching hundreds of feet in length, filled with over 2,000 figures. Soldiers, horses, fortresses, rivers, gods, and kings, all carved with exquisite detail, telling a story without words. For the Roman people, many of whom had never seen the distant mountains of Dacia, this was their window into the war. They could walk around the base of the column, craning their necks upward as the tail spiraled higher and higher. Here they could watch Trajan addressing his troops, crossing the Danube, building bridges, besieging fortresses, and accepting the surrender of enemies. Here they could see the Dacians too, fierce warriors with their long hair and curved fought swords, fighting with desperate courage, defending their hilltop citadels, and finally, submitting to Rome's might. Yet Trajan's column was not simply history, it was propaganda, art in service of power. The emperor appeared again and again along the spiral, larger than those around him, calm and commanding. He was the center of every scene, the bringer of order, the man who directed the storm of war. The Dacians were not mocked or belittled. They were shown as noble, worthy foes, their bravery magnifying the greatness of the man who defeated them. In this way, the column elevated both sides, Rome as the destined victor, and the Dacians as the enemy who made Rome's triumph all the more glorious. The artistry was deliberate in its choices. There was little emphasis on the horrors of war, no fields of mangled corpses, no rivers choked with blood. Instead, the focus was on discipline, construction, and divine favor. Roman engineers are shown building bridges and forts, soldiers cutting roads through forests, and the emperor performing sacrifices to the gods. War was presented not as chaos, but as order imposed upon disorder, civilization pushing into the wild. To gaze upon the column was to see the empire's story of itself, a force of progress and inevitability. Yet for those who knew what had truly transpired in Dacia, the column was also a tomb of memory. Woven into its carvings were glimpses of anguish and loss. Women are shown wailing as their villages burn, prisoners led away in chains, warriors casting themselves from cliffs rather than fall to Roman swords. Decebalus himself, though not depicted in his final act of suicide, is represented through his warriors' stubborn resistance and the desperate defense of their fortresses. These scenes, though framed within Rome's narrative, preserved echoes of the Dacians' last stand, etched forever in marble. The column also spoke to the city itself. Rising in the new forum, surrounded by basilicas, libraries, and the markets that bore Trajan's name, it became part of Rome's architectural heartbeat. Citizens passed it daily, their eyes lifted to its stories, reminded always of the emperor who had brought wealth, land, and glory from beyond the Danube. It was not only a monument to war, but a foundation for legitimacy. The Senate had granted Trajan his triumph, but the column ensured that future generations would see and believe in the justice and greatness of his conquest. In its shadow, veterans told their own tales, embellishing the carved scenes with memories of battles fought in smoke and blood. Merchants pointed to the images of caravans and bridges, knowing that Dacia's mines now fed the empire's wealth. Foreign visitors gazed upon it, awed by the sheer ambition of a ruler who could turn war into art, conquest into permanence. The column was a silent orator, speaking across time, louder than any speech, clearer than any text. As centuries passed, the statue of Trajan atop the column was lost, replaced much later by a Christian saint. Yet the spiral of carvings endured, weathered but still legible, carrying its story long after the empire that built it had crumbled. Scholars, artists, and rulers looked upon it and saw more than propaganda. They saw a record of arms, armor, tactics, and the visual language of Rome. For the descendants of the Dacians, it became a paradox, a monument to their defeat, but also the most vivid surviving testimony of their existence, their courage, and their defiance. In this way, Trajan's column transcended its original purpose. It was built to glorify an emperor and his victories, but it became something greater, a memory carved in stone, surviving the erosion of empires. In the marble spiral, The voices of Romans and Dacians still echo, locked together in their eternal struggle, forever climbing toward the sky. The wars had ended, the fortresses had fallen, and the banners of the wolf lay buried beneath the rubble of Sarmizegetusa. Yet conquest does not erase a people overnight. When Rome proclaimed Dacia pacified, there were still those who whispered in the forests, those who sharpened blades in mountain caves, those who told their children that they were not Romans, but Dacians. The story of the last Dacians is not one of open battles and triumphal columns, but of survival, rebellion, and quiet transformation beneath the shadow of empire. In the years after Trajan's conquest, scattered groups of warriors refused to submit. Some had fled into the mountains before the final siege, carrying what they could, living off wild roots and hidden caches of grain. They struck in raids against Roman convoys and outposts, vanishing into the hills before legionary patrols could catch them. These, men and women, were the remnants of clans who could not accept Rome's law. To the empire, they were outlaws, little more than brigands. To their kin, they were heroes, living proof that Dacian blood still resisted. Rome, however, was relentless. Fortresses rose across the Carpathian passes, garrisons marched through valleys, and the iron grip of administration sought to choke rebellion at its roots. The roads that bound province to empire also made it easier for legions to hunt rebels. Over time, the mountain resistance dwindled. Some were killed in skirmishes, others captured and enslaved, and still others melted back into the villages, blending their defiance into quiet resentment. But Dacian identity did not disappear. In the countryside, farmers still spoke their old tongue, even as Latin seeped into daily life. Songs and stories carried memories of kings and gods, of Burebista, of Decibelus, of Zamoxis promising immortality beyond death. Rituals continued in hidden groves, prayers whispered beneath Roman temples. To the outside eye, the Dacians became Romans, subjects of the empire, provincials bound by its law. Yet beneath the new layers of Latin culture, the old roots remained alive. Many Dacians also entered Roman service. The legions welcomed strong recruits, and auxiliary units filled with Dacian soldiers soon marched under the eagle standard to distant corners of the empire. They fought not for their lost kingdom, but for pay, land, and survival. Yet even within the ranks of Rome's armies, the curved falc's blade appeared, a reminder of the weapon that had once terrified legionaries. These soldiers carried with them both assimilation and memory, serving the empire that had broken their homeland while preserving the spirit of their ancestors through their very presence. Others adapted by joining the new cities that Rome built. Ulpia Traiana Sarmizegetusa, Apulum, Napoca. These became centers of trade and law, where Dacians mingled with settlers from Italy, Gaul, and the Greek world. In time, intermarriage blurred lines of identity. Latin names replaced Dacian ones, Roman garments replaced the traditional tunics, and amphitheatres replaced the hilltop sanctuaries. Yet the stonework of Dacian hands still shaped the walls, the voices of their descendants still echoed in the marketplaces, and in the countryside beyond the cities. Traditions carried on as they always had. The memory of Decibelus, in particular, endured like a scar. For Rome, he was a defeated enemy, a figure of tragic defiance immortalized in Trajan's column. For the Dacians who remained, he was more than that. He was the king who had stood against the greatest empire of the world and chosen death over chains. His story was told by grandfathers to grandchildren, a tale of courage that softened the bitterness of defeat. In his defiance, the people found dignity, a reminder that even in loss, they had not been broken. There were also those Dacians who had never been conquered at all. Beyond the Danube, free tribes still roamed, untouched by Roman garrisons. They watched from the other side of the frontier, raiding at times, trading at others, living as constant reminders that Rome's hold was not absolute. To the provincials within Dacia, these free kin were both inspiration and threat, a living echo of the old ways, but also a danger that drew Rome's wrath upon all, Over the generations, assimilation deepened. The Latin tongue became dominant, the law of Rome the only recognized authority. Temples to Roman gods rose where once the shrines to Zalmoxis had stood. Yet even in assimilation, transformation took place. The Dacians were not erased, they became part of something new. Their blood mixed with that of colonists, their customs shaped the rhythms of provincial life, their words crept into the evolving language. Rome had claimed their land, but the people themselves had left their mark upon the empire that absorbed them. Archaeological traces tell this story silently. Pottery with Roman forms but local designs. Jewelry with motifs that recall ancient Dacian symbols. Inscriptions with Latin letters, but names that echo the old tongue. Even the mines, worked for Roman wealth, bear signs of labor by hands that had once raised sanctuaries to their gods. These fragments remind us that conquest did not erase, but fused. By the time centuries had passed and Rome itself began to tremble under the weight of barbarian invasions, the province of Dacia had become both Roman and not Roman. Its people had taken on Latin speech, Roman law, and imperial identity. Yet in their folklore, in their stubborn resilience, in the very landscape of their mountains and valleys, the memory of the Dacians endured. Even when Rome abandoned the province in the 3rd century, withdrawing its legions and officials, the people who remained carried within them a dual inheritance, the legacy of empire and the whisper of their ancient ancestors. Thus, the last Dacians did not vanish in fire or chains. They endured by adapting, by blending, by remembering. Their swords became plowshares, their kings became legends, their gods became shadows behind Roman temples. And though their kingdom was gone, the essence of their identity survived, quiet, resilient, and woven into the fabric of all that came after. Long after the legions withdrew from the Carpathian valleys, long after the eagles of Rome had vanished from the stone walls of Sarmizegetusa, the memory of the Dacians lingered like an echo in the hills. Though their language slowly dissolved into the Latin of the empire and then into the many tongues that swept across the Balkans, the idea of the Dacians never truly disappeared. It remained buried in the soil, whispered in folk tales, hinted at in place names, and later revived with deliberate passion by scholars, poets, and rulers who sought in that distant people the roots of a modern nation. In the medieval centuries that followed Rome's decline, the lands of Dacia became a crossroads of migrations. Goths, Huns, Avars, Slavs and Magyars all passed through or settled, leaving their mark on the people and the culture. The Dacians themselves, as a distinct people, had long since been absorbed into the provincial mosaic of Rome, but their memory endured in fragments. Chronicles written by Byzantine scholars still spoke of the Getae, the ancient kin of the Dacians, and medieval monks sometimes confused these names with the Goths or other tribes. Yet even in confusion, the shadow of Dacia stretched forward, a faint reminder that the land had once belonged to a kingdom of its own. By the Middle Ages, the inhabitants of the Carpathian lands, the ancestors of modern Romanians, had become a Latin-speaking island in a sea of Slavic peoples. This, in itself, was a mystery. How had a people whose language descended from Latin survived the waves of invasion and conquest? One answer, born of legend and of pride, was that the Latin they spoke was mingled with the tongue of the Dacians, preserved by mountain shepherds and farmers who had refused to vanish. Their continuity became a point of identity. They were the heirs not only of Rome, but also of the Dacians, the first people of the land. This memory deepened in the early modern period. As scholars rediscovered the texts of ancient authors, the story of the Dacians returned to light. Strabo's writings of Burebista, Cassius Dio's accounts of Trajan's wars, the engravings of Trajan's column, all of these offered material for a new narrative. Renaissance humanists in Transylvania and Wallachia began to claim that their people were the descendants of both Romans and Dacians, a blend of conqueror and conquered, forged into a new nation that had endured where empires had fallen. In the 19th century, during the great wave of nationalism that swept across Europe, the figure of the Dacians took on even greater significance. Romantic poets described Decebalus as a tragic hero, a king who had chosen death rather than surrender, a martyr for freedom. Historians emphasized the continuity of Dacian blood, arguing that the Romanians were not strangers in their land, but its most ancient inheritors. The mountains and rivers were said to still carry Dacian names, and the very resilience of the people in the face of foreign domination was seen as proof that the Dacian spirit had never died. Statues of Trajan and Decebalus appeared in public squares. Painters recreated scenes of the wars, sometimes taking inspiration directly from the reliefs of Trajan's column. Intellectuals argued that the Dacians had been as advanced and noble as any people of their age, and that their legacy had been unjustly overshadowed by the Roman narrative of conquest. The falx, once a weapon that terrified legionaries, was reborn as a symbol of pride, etched onto banners and emblems. The greatest symbol of this revival came in stone once again. Near the iron gates of the Danube, a colossal modern monument was carved into the cliffs, the face of Decebalus, stern and defiant, gazing across the river that had once marked the frontier with Rome. This was not an ancient relic, but a deliberate act of memory, a decision to carve into the land itself, a reminder that the Dacians had lived, fought, and endured. Where once Trajan's column had told the story from Rome's perspective, now the mountain face told it from the side of the conquered, immortalizing the king who had resisted to the end. Of course, history and myth often blurred in these retellings. Scholars still debate how much of Dacian culture survived after the Roman conquest, how much of the modern Romanian language carries traces of the old tongue, and to what extent continuity can truly be proven. Yet in the realm of identity, these debates mattered less than the stories themselves. For the people who called themselves Romanians, the Dacians offered a sense of deep roots, of belonging to the soil not just for centuries, but for millennia. The myth of the Dacians also became political. In the 19th and 20th centuries, leaders used the memory of Dacia to strengthen claims of unity. If Romanians were descended from both Romans and Dacians, then their identity was both ancient and unique, uniting the Latin heritage of the empire with the native strength of the Carpathians. This narrative gave weight to aspirations of independence and later to visions of national greatness. Schoolchildren learned of Decebalus as though he were a direct ancestor, his story woven into lessons of patriotism and sacrifice. Even today, the echo of Dacia remains strong. Archaeological sites like Sami Zegatusa are visited not only as ruins, but as sacred places of memory. Festivals reenact the battles, with men dressed as legionaries and others as Dacian warriors, their curved blades gleaming in the sun. Writers and musicians draw upon the imagery of Zalmoxis, of immortality, of the wolf banner, to evoke a sense of mystery and continuity. In popular imagination, the Dacians have become more than history. They are a symbol of resilience, of spirit that cannot be broken, no matter how many empires rise and fall. Thus, the story of the Dacians lives on, not only in marble columns or buried relics, but in the living identity of a people. They may have been conquered, absorbed, and transformed, but their memory has become a thread woven into the fabric of centuries. In the echoes of their name, in the face of their last king carved into stone, and in the pride of those who still call the Carpathians their home, the Dacians endure, not as they once were, but as they are remembered, immortalized in the hearts of their descendants. The story of the Dacians begins in shadows and ends in fire, yet their memory lingers like the echo of a mountain song that never fully fades. From the wild ridges of the Carpathians to the rolling fields along the Danube, their world was shaped by stone and sky, a frontier people who believed that death itself was but a passage into another life. Their rise was swift, their kingdom brief, and their fall catastrophic, yet in that arc of glory and ruin, they carved a place in history that neither marble nor empire could erase. When we look back upon their story, we see first their roots among the Thracian tribes, scattered yet bound by shared myths of gods, immortality, and the unseen threads of fate. The Dacians inherited this tradition, but transformed it into something uniquely their own. Their prophet Zalmoxis gave them not only a god, but a vision, that the soul outlasts the sword, that warriors who fall in battle are not lost, but reborn. It was this belief that made them formidable, men who fought not with fear, but with the certainty that death was merely a door. The geography of their land forged them as well, hemmed in by mountains, fed by rivers, and sustained by fertile valleys. The Dacians grew both resilient and resourceful. The Carpathians were their fortress, their sanctuaries, hidden in high places where stone walls and wooden palisades rose against the horizon. Their capital at Sarmizegetusa was not only a stronghold of war, but a heart of worship, where sanctuaries stood beside fortresses and where the pulse of their culture beat strongest. For centuries, they lived in the shadow of greater powers. To the south lay the Greek colonies of the Black Sea, whose trade and culture mingled with their own. To the east and north, the Scythians and Sarmatians rode the steppes, leaving their mark on Dacian warfare and their choice of arms. To the west, Rome drew ever nearer, first as rumour, then as ally, and finally as the inexorable tide that could not be held back. The Dacians adapted, fought, and sometimes flourished, but the shadow of empire grew long. The brief age of Burebista marked their greatest glory. In a single lifetime, he gathered the tribes into a kingdom that stretched across vast lands, humbled neighbouring peoples, and made Rome itself take notice. His reforms, his ban on wine, his drive for unity, these were the marks of a ruler who sought to raise a scattered people into a nation. Yet his fall through assassination in the year 44 before the Common Era shattered that unity. The kingdom splintered, and the Dacians once more became prey to foreign ambition. It was Decebalus, generations later, who rekindled that flame. Cunning, resilient, and defiant, he rose at a time when Rome itself trembled under the weight of crisis. He played diplomacy and war with equal skill, uniting tribes, striking bargains, and outmaneuvering emperors. Under his leadership, the Dacians became Rome's fiercest northern foe, so dangerous that an emperor of Rome was forced to accept peace at a price of tribute. Few peoples could boast such a feat. But the might of Rome was patient. When Trajan came, he came not merely with legions, but with bridges of stone, roads carved into mountains, and siege engines that turned fortresses into ruins. The first war was brutal, ending in uneasy peace. The second was relentless, ending in fire and ashes. Sarmizegetusa fell, its sanctuaries destroyed, its defenders slain or enslaved. Decebalus chose death over chains, his suicide etched into Roman memory as both triumph and tragedy. With his fall, Dacia became a province of Rome, reorganized into cities, mines, and colonies. Yet, conquest was not annihilation. The Dacians who remained became part of the empire, their blood mingling with settlers, their traditions slipping quietly beneath the Latin veneer. Some served in Rome's armies, carrying their curved falx blades to distant frontiers. Others whispered their myths in villages and fields, passing down fragments of identity that would outlast the empire itself. In time, their story became legend. For Rome, the Dacian Wars were immortalized in Trajan's column, the great spiral of marble that showed the emperor's victory in images that still endure. For the descendants of those lands, the memory of the Dacians became a root of identity, revived in medieval chronicles, celebrated by modern nationalism, and enshrined in monuments carved into cliffs and mountainsides. Decebalus became a symbol of defiance, not a defeated king, but a figure of pride. The Dacians, though conquered, became eternal through the very act of remembrance. Their rise was brief, their kingdom fragile, their fall inevitable before the weight of Rome. Yet their legacy is larger than their years of power. They remind us that identity can survive conquest, that belief can outlast empire, that even a people swallowed by history can echo across centuries. The Dacians may have lost their throne, their fortresses, and their independence, but they gained something rarer: immortality in memory. And so the story closes where it began, in the mountains and valleys of the Carpathians, where the wind still carries whispers of their gods, their kings, and their warriors. The rise and fall of the Dacians was a fleeting flame, but its light has not gone out. It glows still in the heritage of those who claim descent from them, in the myths that refuse to die, and in the stones that once bore their sanctuaries. In triumph and in ruin, they remain, remembered forever as the people who dared to defy the empire of Rome.